I can hear you. I can hear you. I can hear you.
Excellent, excellent.
Thanks for being our discussant.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. All right.
Just want to let you know the recording has started.
Sounds good. Okay, so it sounds like it's already 3. Shall we kickstart the afternoon session? So thank you everybody for being here in late Friday afternoon. And thanks to the conference organizer for including our paper in this program. I'm here today to talk about the project that I work with Jessica Fong from Michigan and Anita Rao from Chicago, where we look at how we could debunk misinformation in advertising. Since I might not be able to see everybody's face, if you have a question, please do feel free to interrupt. Okay. All right. So I believe we all have heard some types of misinformation in the past 2 years. And in fact, misinformation in advertising is even more severe than everybody thinks on social media. So in this project, we look at a specific type of misinformation, which is the false claims that the ingredient X in some that's commonly contained in some product categories is toxic. Let me give you one solid example of such piece of misinformation. So Ricewell, that's a real brand, that's a real product, which got a reputation for producing fluoride-free toothpaste. So on their social media account, what is a little bit upsetting is the capture here. What they say is trying to avoid the toxic ingredients found in traditional fluoride toothpaste. Try Ricewell, the natural toothpaste that's quote unquote scientifically proven to work. So for types of communication in social media advertising like these, brands usually try to make some unproven statement, either directly states or indirectly implies that some commonly included active ingredient in the product category from their competitors is toxic. Another example comes from deodorant category. Again, there are some debates around whether aluminum deodorant is toxic, but there's no scientific proof to show that the amount included in normal deodorant product is toxic. So this is the type of misinformation we consider in this project. Now, what do we want to answer? We want answers to these 2 questions. First of all, for these claims that either directly state or indirectly imply misinformation, do such claims influence the actual purchase behavior from the consumers? And if so, does debunking really work to reset it? We, in our design, we would also be able to compare the effectiveness across sources from looking at the messages from regulators, social, major media, and the competitor firm. The second research question that we want an answer is if we indeed find some level of effectiveness of such debunking messages, is it really working through changing your preferences while correcting misbeliefs, or it just merely reinforces the correct beliefs held by part of the population? In other words, we're quite interested in who is most swayed by this piece of misinformation and the debunking messages. We do see from the literature, there are different theories predicting different outcomes. So it remains an empirical question in our consumption setting, given these different theoretical predictions that I will go into a discussion in a little deeper. Now, I'm going to talk about an online experiment. Okay, so we did an online discrete choice experiment to test the results and why we cannot work with observational data. Well, it is really hard to find exogenous shocks where brands introduce claims. More often than not, you will realize that a new entrant entering some product category, they're making claims of that contains potential misinformation at the same time when they observe there's a peak demand for the ingredient-free product. So for example, misinformation about GMOs, genetically modified organism, might coincide with increased demand for this GMO-free product. So that's why observational data may not be appropriate in this case for us to measure the causal impact. Now, why not try a field experiment? Well, we're working with something that we need extra caution. It's actually pretty hard to eliminate all this misinformation going around on social media with a simple retweet. The treatment that we use containing misinformation could go out completely outside of our control. And in fact, during the pandemic, there was a Facebook white paper showing that within simply 22 days of the emergence of certain piece of misinformation about COVID, although Facebook was able to knock that down within 22 days, it still generated more than 1 million eyeballs. So debriefing everyone exposed to the social media misinformation is practically impossible. Now, a field experiment may not even be an optimal solution to our research question, because for all these field experiments, it is quite difficult to control for attention. So think about when you observe that your debunking messages just doesn't work. Is it because that people are not paying attention to it, or that they've received that debunking message, they paid attention, but they just refuse to update their belief? It is unclear which way it goes in field experiment. So we do have to have some sort of control over their beliefs and attention. In this project, all the findings we are going to report later would be conditional on these subjects paying attention to our treatment. So a quick outline of what I'm going to go through with you. We are using the incentive compatible conjoint experiment in answering the research questions. I'm going to quickly show you the main effect we get from our first experiment that measures the average causal effect of introducing this piece of misinformation in our product categories and the average effect of debunking messages. Then I'm going to go a little deeper into the heterogeneity part and show you some results about which groups of people that are more or less influenced by these messages. And it's quite helpful for us to understand the potential mechanisms behind how these debunking messages are getting processed. Towards the end, I would also discuss why I would also discuss the different incentives generated for incumbent firms in responding to such kind of misinformation in the market. Do they want to debunk, or do they want to conform to misinformation? So as I said, we institute incentive compatible conjoint experiment. It's pre-registered and conducted online. We have 2x4 design where as the first treatment, we show all subjects a version of the real social media ad we find. It's either a control version of the ad or an ad containing misinformation. Then the participant would proceed to the second treatment, which falls into one of the 4 conditions, a control message or debunking message as positioned from regulators, media, or competitors. I will show more details about those. Then we would quickly check for their recalls, and the participant will move on to make their choices. Towards the end, we'd also include several questions that surveying their demographics, as well as further verification checks and debriefing.
Is it okay to ask a question?
Yes, please.
So does everybody agree whether or not something can be called misinformation. Basically, how is misinformation defined? Who knows?
That's a very good question. So misinformation, we take the definition from the literature of misinformation that it is unsubstantiated claims of the product quality. So it is also consistent with FTC requirement, which is the advertisers should not make unsupported and exaggerated claim of their product and or imply any potential misinformation regarding their competitors. So that's the definition we take for this project.
No, I'm thinking in terms of your experiment. I understand the FTC definition, but the FTC has a way of asking for evidence if there is supporting evidence. But what about the subjects? How do they know if it's misinformation?
So first of
Tell them
all,
it's misinformation.
Your questions actually related to my next slides. So
Okay,
why don't we
you.
hold off on that, and I will come
Thank
back to that question in the next slide. Okay, so before I move on to what can be called a misinformation and how we select the potential treatment we use, let me emphasize at this moment that for all the treatment, we prioritize using the real world message. It's a real social media ad we find, and there's real debunking efforts from all three sources. Okay, so let me quickly go through the criteria we use in selecting the so-called misinformation in these consumption goods. First of all, we pick the product categories where we see at least one firm advertising something that says their product is X-free. For example, in toothpaste case, their product is fluoride-free. And at the same time, they would either directly state or implies that this ingredient, for example, fluoride, is toxic. Okay, so that's the type of misinformation we look at. And then, in addition to that criteria, we also want to make sure that in the same product category, there's another competing firm, as well as the regulator and media, they actively debunk such messages. Again, in fluoride's case, you would see many major brands like Colgate and Crest keep telling you that there's good reason why you need a fluoride in your toothpaste. And you also have a similar education materials coming from the major media and the regulators. And for all these real content, real materials of debunking effort, we will use those in our treatment. Okay, so with these selection criteria, we end up with these three product categories in our study. We look at these ingredients, aluminum in deodorant, fluoride in toothpaste, and GMO in food. And specifically, that's nutrition shakes. So we come up with the sample size based on pre-registered, based on a pilot study, and every main study has been pre-registered. So for the sake of time, I will not talk about all the details of every product category. Let's start with the deodorant, given that the ingredient is letter A. So I'm going to use deodorant as an example to illustrate the studies we design and the result we find. For aluminum and deodorant, it's quite controversial. And in fact, if you Google aluminum deodorant, right, the keywords doesn't contain any emotional words, there's no right or wrong, and you will find a lot of online debate whether aluminum in deodorant is bad. Again, the definition of why we consider it a piece of misinformation is there's currently no scientific evidence to support that the amount of aluminum included in deodorant is bad for general population. And in fact, there is a good reason why you find aluminum in your deodorant. That's actually the active ingredient for Stop Your Sweat. So in treating our participants, the very first treatment they're exposed to would be a copy of the social media ad. For the control ad, here's the one we show them. This is the ad we find on Kopari Instagram. It basically talks about how wonderful their product is. And then for the misinformation condition, we find a similar ad, again from Kopari, that tells you that don't let your deodorant hold you down with toxic ingredients. Get on the natural side of things with our aluminum-free cocoa deodorant. Admittedly, you might notice that the message from the control version and treatment version are not exactly identical. That is because we prioritize that we find the real message from them rather than we draft our own messages. And we have to make in interpreting the result we obtain, we have to make an assumption that although the control and treated ads are emphasizing or highlighting different product attributes, the product attributes gets highlighted in the control condition is not correlated with the preference for the debated ingredient, in this case, aluminum. With that working assumption in mind, when we analyze our conjoined choice data, we also include dummies for different product attributes that could partly control for the general preference for the attribute discussed in the control condition. Okay, so this is the first treatment. Then after the participant read about this ad, they would move on to the second treatment. Under the control condition, we're going to show them a piece of fun fact about the product categories. In this case, Egyptians were credited to be the first to create the first deodorant. And for the other three conditions, we use exactly the same message. Aluminum containing products are safe for topical use. Aluminum in deodorant products prevents sweat buildup, and scientific studies have found no conclusive evidence that it causes adverse health effects. The only difference across these three conditions are that some of them are depicted as from the CDC, others are from the major media, MSN, or another strong competitor to Kopari, Speedstick. And I also want to highlight that for all these Twitter message, the link we include, they are real link. The participants can click on these links and that will redirect them to the actual articles from a CDC or MSN or Speedstick, okay? So after they finish reading these treatment messages, all the participants will move on to make their choices. We let them choose from 10 sets of choices. Each of these choice questions would offer three product profiles configured differently and one no-buy decision. We incentivize these respondents to reveal their true willingness to pay by telling them that we're going to hold a lottery, and we did run a lottery towards the end, and they would have a chance to win one of their selected products from the study. So now you might notice that for these product profile, it's characterized by the brand name, by whether it contains the focal ingredient, by another balancing attribute, and price. Okay, and in our choice model, we do have dummies for all these. So before I show you the main effect, let's take a pause and think about what could the result be. Think about the effect of misinformation on their purchase behavior, right? So you might expect to find no effect, no impact at all. That might be that they're just not looking at the misinformation, or misinformation doesn't work, or maybe they're already very, very misinformed and you already see a ceiling effect of misinformation. So introducing an additional dose of misinformation just doesn't change much. Or you might see that this additional dose of misinformation indeed reduces their willingness to pay. It could go either way. Now, for the second research question, would debunking really work? It could positively influence their purchase behavior by increasing their willingness to pay. It could negatively impact their willingness to pay, as some of the literature from behavioral science suggests that corrective messages can backfire, but it could also have literally zero impact. Okay, so before we move on to the result, at least in our mind, it's not yet clear whether in this case, these information really works.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Do you think it
Yes.
matters whether the misinformation is a clear, incorrect claim versus it just implies it? So in your example, it didn't actually say the aluminum was toxic.
Mhm.
You have some
Yeah.
products which will just say aluminum free, and they don't even say anything beyond that.
Mhm.
You could have
Yep.
something where it's explicitly, other deodorants have toxic aluminum, in which case it's more than implied, and it seems like it might matter.
True, true. So I have to say, in our design, we didn't allow the variation in the degree of how strong their claim is. And I'm with you. My intuition is if there is a direct statement as described just now, so strong, then probably the effect of such message would be even stronger in the study. So that's my intuition, but unfortunately, our study, because we prioritize using the real world messages, we weren't able to introduce this level of variation. Okay, so let me first show you the main effect. Okay, and the main effect is all about their willingness to pay. Before all these participants ever look at our treatment, okay, this is before they look at our treatment, we measure their baseline preference for these debated ingredients in each of these product categories. And that's sort of intuitive and very consistent with the real world evidence. People do not like aluminum in deodorant. People do not like GMO. People like, on average, fluoride. And the estimated willingness to pay after controlling for everyone else, after controlling for brands, for other attributes, the estimated willingness to pay for these ingredients pretty much match the real world example. For example, in aluminum's case, if you look at Dove, Dove deodorant, aluminum free, is roughly $2 more expensive than Dove aluminum with Dove deodorant with aluminum. Okay. So this is the baseline even before they receive treatment. Now we show them the very first treatment, which is either a control ad or an ad containing that implied toxicity claim. We do not see a significant effect for deodorant or the food. We do see a significant negative effect on willingness to pay in fluoride, in toothpaste product category. And looks like it only influences those products that are positively viewed. And then we introduce the second treatment, which is a debunking message. So we do see across all product categories, all three product categories, debunking messages helps move the willingness to pay backwards to pre-treatment level. Although statistically speaking, only for deodorant category and for toothpaste category, that's where we observe a significant increase in willingness to pay after debunking. Okay, so looks like at this moment, debunking works on average. And it's pretty helpful to repair the damage caused by this extra dose of misinformation we introduced. So we further move on to check whether that effectiveness would vary by all these different information sources, because you would naturally think some sources are more reputable than the other, and therefore more effective. Roughly speaking, this is indeed what we find. Regulators, as seen in a green bar, in 2 of the 3 categories are more effective than major media or competitor brand. However, interestingly, for the GMO ingredient in the food category, competitor messaging, competitor debunking is actually the only channel, the only message that significantly works. Okay, so we do have some guess, we have some conjecture why this could be the case, but this is not the focus of our study, so we cannot test the conjecture. I can tell you that we do think that's somewhat because of the novelty. So in GMO's case, we're using Soylent. And if some of you do drink nutrition shakes and you care about the GMO ingredient, you might know that Soylent, as you can tell from the name, was predominantly made from soy. And in the US, 94% of the soy are GMO. So they cannot avoid GMO. And what they did instead is they ran really bold campaign saying that we are proudly made from GMO. And they explain why GMO is not a bad thing. So our conjecture here is the reason why we see such a positive effect from a firm debunking, competitor debunking, was because of that novelty, where you normally do not see that kind of debunking from a competitor. But again, this is something for future research. Okay, so up to this point, we've looked at the average effect on preference, right? The average effect on willingness to pay. Now, let's think about how that could happen. We're still not yet clear whether debunking really works by really working on something that's fundamentally problematic, which is the misbelief. With the choice data from conjoint only, it's really hard to tease apart the impact on preference from the impact on belief. And again, it goes back sort of to the earlier questions from the audience that how can we tell that it's misinformation, right? How can we tell people have misbelief? We need to measure their beliefs directly. So with these choice data alone, we won't be able to measure that. Now, also thinking from more theory perspective, the prediction is also unclear. If you think that all these participants can update their beliefs in a very unbiased Bayesian way, then it would predict that they could internalize this message, update their prior beliefs, and change their behavior accordingly. If that's the case, that would be encouraging news for policymakers. However, we all see all these literature talking about how people can be biased, that they can suffer from a confirmatory bias. So let's say they update their beliefs in a very biased way, such as confirmation bias. Then it will predict that people who have misbelief before, who just refuse to take aluminum because they think it's bad, they would not even internalize your debunking message because they either misinterpret that message or they just refuse to place any weight on that debunking message. Okay, so with the toy model, I'm not going to show you the toy model, the nitty-gritty thing here, but with the simulation, if the dominating mechanism in our participants' mind is the biased Bayesian updating, is the unbiased Bayesian updating, then we would expect to see those who have a relatively harmful prior belief are those who get most updates after seeing the debunking message, okay? And if across all our participants, they're mostly updating in a very biased confirmation bias way, you would expect those who have relatively less harmful or neutral prior belief before would be the one who's going to update the most when they see the debunking message. Again, teasing these apart would require us to measure belief, right? Looking at the preference data, looking at the choice data alone is not helpful. We cannot disentangle preferences and beliefs based on the conjoint data alone. As I briefly described, if you observe a low willingness to pay for aluminum, for example, it can be either driven by you just don't like aluminum because it stains your clothes, or you have a strong belief about the toxicity. Okay, I think aluminum is toxic, and we need to measure that. So how do we do that? We create a second study where we ask these participants, what do you think is the percent chance that aluminum in deodorant is harmful to your health? Just the same as how Mansky was asking his participants in his 2008 paper. So we elicit belief about aluminum, both before and after our choice, our treatment and choice measurement. And to avoid the demand effect on aluminum ingredient only, we actually ask this belief questions for all product attributes and for all brands. Okay, so now I'm talking about aluminum here. So why do we focus on aluminum? We do see from study one that we get more precise measurement than the food category. And aluminum looks like there's pretty strong pre-existing misbeliefs than fluoride. And we do have a budget constraint. So to guarantee the sample size and to guarantee we could capture the heterogeneity across different prior belief groups, we have to restrict to only one product category at this moment. So we're going to focus on aluminum in the second study. Okay, and we're going to only use regulator debunking as the debunking source. So we have the same steps as we went through in the first study. And the only difference is we elicit their beliefs before and after treatments. Note that when we elicit belief, when we elicit their prior belief, we also ask open-ended questions for why you think so. Okay, again, that's for every product attribute, not just for aluminum. So then we can somewhat have a descriptive understanding of why they don't like aluminum. Is it because they think it's toxic, or is it because they're just allergic to chemicals, or is it because it stains their clothes? Prior beliefs as the baseline, we do see a good spread of prior belief of aluminum. This is quite consistent with the negative willingness to pay we saw in the first survey, okay, where most people think aluminum is actually harmful. Still, we have some people who are pretty sure, who are pretty certain that aluminum in deodorant is fine. So we ran the second survey, and what we find is indeed debunking influences preferences via correcting their prior misbeliefs. So here, what I'm showing here, these are the curves that plots the estimated change in their willingness to pay for aluminum only with regard to their prior belief groups. Okay, so we have 5 prior belief groups. If we look at the pure effect of introducing the piece of misinformation, then we see people whose prior was quite benign, right? Who didn't think that aluminum is harmful. They significantly reduce their willingness to pay after seeing that piece of misinformation from that social media ad. But if your prior is already quite consistent with this piece of misinformation, you don't see much. You don't see a statistically significant impact on your willingness to pay as the result of misinformation. And then for the green curve, it plots the pure effect coming from debunking, and the blue curve plots the net effect of both the first treatment and the second treatment. The first treatment, again, is misinformation, and the second treatment is debunking. So what we find that debunking in this case is quite effective in shifting up your willingness to pay. And it's more consistent to the unbiased Bayesian updating framework that we discussed in the beginning. Basically says when you have what you previously think aluminum is quite harmful, this is when the debunking message is very different from your prior belief, right? And this is when that piece of information contains the largest information gain, and that's when you update the most. So on average, it looks like people are updating in a good way as what policymakers would want to see. We also measure the stated beliefs, and it again, let me quickly since we still have some time, let me quickly show you the effect on stated beliefs. So first of all, for those who definitely think aluminum is not harmful, misinformation shifts their beliefs upwards. This is consistent with their choice. And then an additional dose of misinformation does not make debunking significantly less effective. And debunking is more effective for those with prior, telling them that this is not a good thing for them. Okay, so we confirm both in their behavior, both in their action and in their belief that debunking works. It works by shifting your prior misbeliefs. So now, let me go back to our discussion. Okay, we've seen the measurement of the effect of misinformation and debunking. Now, let's take a pause and ask, if debunking indeed works, why do we see so many firms conforming to that piece of misinformation? Here, we are talking about an entrant who is spreading the misinformation when it enters the market, and how does these incumbents respond to that piece of misinformation. We can use the estimate we acquire from previous study to run a simulation exercise. We simulate the market share these incumbent firms may earn by debunking or by introducing a new product that complies with misinformation, and compare that simulated market share to the market share they may earn if they do nothing. And then we can comment on the incentives for them to do one way or another. So what we find from the simulation exercise is throughout the three categories, all three categories, we see that the incumbent could benefit from debunk. Okay, so if they debunk, that helps with their market share. However, if they introduce an additional X-free product, that would improve their market share even more. So that's what we think why these incumbent firms do not seem to be ready to debunk, but rather they would conform with the misinformation. In other words, that's why we see they charge a higher price for aluminum-free deodorant. You would also find fluoride-free toothpaste, and people are just getting more and more used to think non-GMO food is a better thing. Okay, so let me quickly conclude. What do we find from this study? First of all, misinformation reduces their willingness to pay.
I have another 10 minutes.
Okay, thanks, Jean. So I'm almost there. Takeaway from our study, misinformation in our cases, we find the evidence that it does reduce the willingness to pay for all three product categories. But if we only care about the significance, then we find a significantly reduction in willingness to pay for fluoride. Okay, that's when the ingredient is quite preferred. And then by introducing corrective messages afterwards, it's quite effective in reverting the harm caused by that additional dose of misinformation. And in fact, in the case of aluminum in deodorant, it's even effective in reverting the prior misbeliefs that's already spreading on the market. And we think that this is ideal outcome. This is quite good news for regulators because they would want to see that the corrective messages is not just persuading you for doing something that you don't believe. They would wish that the debunking really works by changing the misinformed beliefs. Now, as I mentioned a little early on, for this controlled experiment, everything is conditional on participants paying attention to misinformation. We do have some follow-up work that looks into the role of inattention. And I would be very happy to talk about it offline. So thank you very much for your attention late Friday afternoon. And you can find our paper on SSRN. And should you have any more questions, please feel free to email me. Thank you.
Would you like to address a question in the chat box?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I do see.
Sorry, Tong, I thought Anita was in the session. I apologize. I essentially just wanted to know, why are you focusing on the debunking aspect of these claims? Because in all of your examples, the claims debunked and they provided evidence on why that ingredient was important. And if we all know that fluoride helps prevent cavities, it can explain why you don't see much movement in toothpaste. But if most of us are uninformed about the fact that aluminum is what leads to the antiperspirant qualities in deodorants, then your debunking claim is actually saying, no, this is why aluminum offers benefits as well.
Okay.
So it'd be great to see some sort of measurement on the degree to which people know about those positive aspects of the ingredient, not just the negative ones.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Brian. We actually have some measured data on that. So in the second survey, when we ask open-ended question for why you think so, that tells us how much information, how much knowledge you have towards that ingredient. That's before they see the first treatment, right? So that really measures the prior knowledge they have before they enter the treatment. So we know, I recall some interesting answers like, well, I think it's okay because if it's not okay, then why do we see so many products doing this on the market? And I also see people offering a very thorough scientific explanation why this is okay. Like in your description, well, we need fluoride, we need aluminum because it helps, because fluoride helps stop cavity, because aluminum helps stop sweat buildup. So we can observe that differentiation across population. Now, because we didn't devise our sample size to be offering enough power to detect the significance across these groups with different level of knowledge, we do not, I don't think we have enough power to comment on whether people with more or less knowledge could respond to this message more or less effectively. But that would be a very interesting direction we should go as a next step. Okay, so I think there's another question in chat box.
Yes, I'm not sure if I missed it or not. I was just wondering if there's difference between the response to the debunk,
Yes.
specifically between someone who's certain about like misinformation compared to someone who like is likely believing that, for example, aluminum is toxic.
Sure. Yeah. So let me again quickly share the slide that could speak to your question. Okay. So here we, in the x-axis, we have 5 different groups. These people who they have different level of prior beliefs, and then y-axis measures their response to debunking or misinformation. So to your question, the answer would be in the green curve and the blue curve. Okay, so there's some degree of heterogeneity in debunking effect between individuals who have different level of prior belief.
Okay, thanks. So like regarding the last group, I think the heterogeneity is maximum in that group. Is that correct? The people who are like finding it definitely harmful.
So by heterogeneity, I mean those who think it's definitely not harmful do not respond that much to the debunking message compared to those who did think it's harmful.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Tom.
Yes.
I have a question about the experiment itself. Maybe like get a little bit into the cognitive component. So in the presentation, you did explain how the experiments are done. So my understanding is that I see an ad, and then I see something to debunk that misinformation.
Correct.
And I typically make a decision within like say half an hour. I mean the time frame.
Yes,
I was wondering in practice, somebody, so this is taken away from the experiment, but rather say we want to take this to policy and to competition, for example, somebody see these things repeatedly, right? So I have time to reflect on this. I have to see 2 conflicting messages. Which one do I believe more, right?
Yes.
Whether there's some kind of difference between systematic difference that maybe from psychology, from cognitive science, that we can know that the short-term experiment is going to be biased in certain ways.
Yeah, so I think there are 2 very good points you've made. First, the timing between the first treatment and the second treatment are pretty short in our study, right? So once they see the ad, they immediately see the debunking message. We do this because for a controlled experiment, we really want to emphasize the control at this moment, that they are paying attention. And we want to minimize the interference they might get from outside world. Okay, so I do think there's a good reason that for future research, we should consider the extended effect after they go away for a few weeks or even longer, and then check how their behavior would change. And that would be even more complex than how they process the information, because that get involved in how they recall the information, right? There is a role of memory here.
Right.
We do not measure that. Now, your second point is about competition. What if they see 2 competing messages from, let's say, Kopari in this case, and Speed Stick? How do they process 2 competing messages if they get exposed to each of those repeatedly. I think that's definitely possible. That's what's going on. We avoid to measure the direct comparison across competitors, and this Kopari, this focal firm, in a repeated version. To some degree, there is some kind of comparison here by first seeing Kopari message.
Oh, that's exactly what I mean. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yes. So to some degree, the effectiveness coming from the competitor message here captures that, right? To some degree, if you look at the first bar, the light blue bar, competitor messages appear to be also very effective in 2 out of 3 product categories.
But the order is fixed, right? The misinformation has to come first and then debunking.
True,
But in practice,
true,
could somebody
true.
have the opposite? Yeah.
True. Then
Mhm.
that would be a case of pre-bunking. Again, my understanding is the pre-bunking would also involve some degree of recall,
Okay.
the role of memory, and we cannot capture that. So we cannot speak to that.
Right, thanks.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I have a quick question.
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I'm Kai. So I think there's a lot of emphasis in using real world marketing messages. I was wondering why there's such an emphasis. I mean, wouldn't it be cleaner to use hypothetical marketing messages because we would not be contaminating the experiment with unobserved heterogeneity, such as consumers' higher experience and brand loyalty, and so on?
Okay, so I think there are 2 things here. First of all, what's the benefit of running the experiment with a real world example? Right, it's more for consideration out of consideration of external validity. Second, the worry is if you use the real message, then they're not exactly identical. Then would you ignore the effect from, let's say, brand loyalty or things like that? We think that can, to a satisfactory degree, be controlled by brand dummy in a choice model. So we do include brand dummy, and we do test whether these brand preference significantly shifts after seeing different versions of treatment, and we do not see evidence for that. Also, for product attributes like the one that gets highlighted in control version, we also test whether that gets significantly changed afterwards. We do not see that. So overall, we think the harm for using slightly different messages compared to the benefit of keeping it real is acceptable. So that's why we make our choice.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have another question? Oh, okay. So I think if there's no more question, then I would give the screen away to Khaled. And thank you, Khaled, for discussing our paper.
Very nice. Excellent. So let me share my screen. Okay. All right. So you see my slides, right? Okay, excellent. So thank you very much for inviting me to discuss this very interesting paper, Debunking Misinformation in Advertising. So I'm Khaled, I'm an assistant professor at Cornell University. So first of all, I would like to say that I really enjoyed reading this paper. I enjoyed reading it very much. Thank you very much, Jessica, Tong, and Anita for the creative idea, the creative experimental and empirical setting. There is a lot of excellent analysis that I will not cover in this discussion. I am, however, going to make a few comments, and I will try to relate them to a little bit to literature on information overload, a little bit. And then my comments, they will be just related to some robustness checks that the authors could run in order to make sure that the results hold. But other than that, it's a really good paper. So basically, the main idea of this paper, the key question is, does debunking effectively correct consumers' misinformed beliefs? There are 2 parts here. There's the misinformation and there's the debunking. The misinformation is, I send you an advertising telling you that my product is better because it doesn't have fluoride. For example, a toothpaste doesn't have fluoride. And then the customer would infer that fluoride is bad for your teeth, which is wrong. And basically, that's the misinformation part. There's the debunking part where basically either the regulator or the competitor would send an advertising message in order to correct that misinformation, either by saying that fluoride is actually good for your teeth or doing something else. So the authors really do a great job and very creative job in running an experiment. And they have three key findings. The first finding is that misinformation decreases willingness to pay for a given feature. For example, if I tell you that my product is better, my toothpaste is better because it doesn't have fluoride, then the willingness to pay of the customer for fluoride, for the feature fluoride, goes down. They also show that actually debunking, correcting this misinformation, can repair the decrease in willingness to pay. So either from the regulator or from the competitor. And they also look at the mechanism by which this debunking is effective. And this is effective because it corrects the misinformed beliefs, in the sense that this correction happens at the belief change of the customers. This paper is really interesting because it provides insightful implications for policymakers. First, it shows that actually debunking works, in the sense that if someone advertises and misinforms the customers, then the policymaker can actually alter that misinformation and correct the beliefs of the customers. But that also provides very interesting results for the firms, because the firms could, or at least the strategic behavior of the firms, because now they can comply with the misinformation, and they actually, through simulation, the authors show that this is what the firm should do. What I like about the paper is actually the experimental setting. I really enjoyed seeing how they basically leverage a conjoint experiment in order to really reveal the preferences of the customers. And they manipulated the information or the misinformation in order to find how the demand through the part worth or the estimated parameters of the conjoint are impacted. There is also a very interesting theoretical aspect of the paper, because the authors provide an insightful Bayesian updating model. They show how the beliefs propagate in an optimal Bayesian fashion and what happens when there is a biased Bayesian learning. So these are the nice aspects of the paper. Now I'm going to just discuss one comment that I have about the paper, and this actually relates to some measurement, or the way the authors are measuring willingness to pay. So basically, in their estimation of the conjoint, the authors use the following utility function, where basically there is a focal feature. This is the feature of interest, fluoride, and somehow they say that the demand for fluoride, or the attractiveness of the focal feature, will depend on the experimental setting, depending on the information that the customer receives. They also control for the price and the other features, just like in a regular conjoint setting. After that, they say that the willingness to pay for a given experimental condition is given by the demand parameter for the focal feature divided by the price sensitivity, as estimated by conjoint. The thing here is that I felt that there are no theoretical guarantees that tell us that actually the price sensitivity or the gamma parameters, the part worth of the other features, they actually don't vary given the set of information that the customer has. And actually, there is lots of literature in psychology, also in econ, that shows that actually information could impact the flux of information that the customer has could impact the market shares of the alternatives, most importantly, the no choice. And basically, there is a set of literature that says that the market share of the no choice could decrease if we have tons of information. But there is also new studies that show the share of no choice could increase when the customer is facing information overload. All right. But why would this be an issue in the measurement of the willingness to pay? It's because actually I didn't see if the focal alternative, given the information, the misinformation and the debunking, if the focal alternative that contains the focal feature is losing market share to the competitors or to the no choice. And the issue is the utility of the no choice is fixed to 0, in the sense that if the market share of the no choice increases, then all the utilities of all the alternatives, they have to inflate or deflate if the market share of the no choice decreases. And somehow this would lead that, this would tell us that actually not only the beta ST or the parameter, demand parameter of the focal alternative that will be altered by the experimental condition, but also the price sensitivity and the part worth of the other alternatives. What I would suggest for the authors to do is to allow all parameters to vary by experimental condition, in the sense that not only estimate an alpha and a gamma, but estimate an alpha, a price sensitivity per experimental condition, and a part worth set of part worth by experimental condition. And somehow this will give more or less a more accurate estimation of the willingness to pay, because the willingness to pay per experimental condition would become beta ST divided by alpha ST. Of course, if it happens that all the alpha, that this theory of no choice doesn't hold, and that happens that all the price sensitivities, they are not altered or changed by the information, the flux of information that the customers are having, then in that case, basically the willingness to pay will still hold, and there's no need to run this. But this is just as a robustness check. I have also another set of interesting extensions that one could extend this paper. So, for example, the experimental setting represents an excellent opportunity to estimate learning dynamics. I was a little bit excited when I saw the Bayesian learning framework, and I was somehow expecting the model to be estimated in a structural fashion. But somehow I thought maybe this could be actually a very nice extension of the paper in the future. Also, I was very curious after reading the paper to see how should the firm react to misinformation when the regulator debunks versus the media, in a sense that maybe the firm will have a different strategy as soon as the regulator debunks. Also, it would be very interesting to run a welfare analysis to see how this different sets of information impact the welfare of the customers or the choices of the customers. And also, finally, usually when it comes to pricing or to understand the profits of the company, it would be really interesting to see if the implications or the managerial implications that the authors suggest for companies, they still hold when the objective of the company is not to maximize market share, but to maximize the revenue, because usually revenue is what we really what the firms really care about. So to conclude, I think that this is a very relevant research question. It falls within this realm of misinformation that we've been living in the last, I would say, 5 years. I think that the paper has a very elegant experimental investigation. And finally, I think that the authors provided insightful empirical results and great managerial implications, which makes the paper really a very nice paper to read. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Khaled.
If there's no further question, we could proceed to the second presentation.
Cool. Should I share my screen?
Yes, Rupali, you can go ahead.
Cool. Okay, so I can get started. Can everyone see my screen? Okay, so thanks everyone for joining, and I'll be presenting this work studying the impact of marketing analytics on entrepreneur and firm performance. It is based on a field experiment with small firms in Rwanda. And I should add that we're in the process of finalizing the manuscript of this. So any feedback or comments would be super helpful and very welcome. I cannot see raised hands, but I can see the chat. But feel free to unmute yourself and just talk. Okay, so let's begin. And because we are sort of based in this marketing analytics space in this project, let's begin by defining it. So marketing analytics is the process of recording, measuring, and analyzing marketing performance of an organization. And it is undertaken with the hope that there will be an increase in effectiveness or performance of the firm undertaking it, right? And it is a very broad term, and it can vary a lot across different organizations in its complexity levels. So one way of classifying it is based on this level of complexity. So the first level, which is also the most simple, is Analytics 1.0, where managers just start to go beyond their gut feel and intuition and start using data in decision making. An example here would be a small firm starting to record daily sales and customer interaction data to see if they could make better decisions using some insights from that data. Then we have Analytics 2.0, which is a slightly more advanced form and uses big data from transactional systems, external as well as internal to the organization. And an example here would be eBay using some customer search data and using machine learning techniques to identify which customers to target for advertising. And finally, Analytics 3.0, which is the most advanced of the lot, uses traditional business intelligence and big data to create intelligent customer offerings. And also it promotes sort of real-time decision-making. An example here would be Amazon analyzing all the clickstream data, purchase data of customers to see which products to target and suggest to which customers, and maybe also change the look and feel of the site depending on who's logging in. So it is a very vast real estate of analytics, but in this paper, we are focused only on Analytics 1.0, which is the more simple form, just recording essential data and then doing very simple statistics, tables, and graphs with it. And the reason why we are focused on Analytics 1.0, when clearly 2.0, 3.0 is where the world is moving, are twofold. So while we see that the bigger firms might be moving and investing a lot in analytics nowadays, and as we saw yesterday in Minji's presentation, those of you attended, she demonstrated it in a B2B context. But when we look at small firms, the story is not the same. There are studies by McKinsey and Woodruff which show that there are the firms in sort of these developing countries like Kenya, Mexico, Uganda, are very low when it comes to their analytical capabilities. And we also conducted some pilot studies in Rwanda and other areas of Africa to show that the exposure to analytics is very low for these small firms. And one would think that the story is not the same in developed countries, but actually it is quite low in terms of the analytics adoption by small firms. And there are studies by some studies in France and Ireland, but also in the United States, the surveys that have been conducted last year and the year before the last show that the analytics adoption in small firms is pretty low. And given small firms are very important for the economy, not just in terms of GDP contribution, but also in terms of employment, it makes sense that if at all Analytics 1.0, analytics can lead to improvement in firms, then 1.0 is a natural starting point for these small firms who have absolutely no exposure to analytics or capabilities yet for it. And the second reason why we target 1.0 is because we want to study the impact of analytics technology on the individuals who are interacting with it as well. So there are studies which suggest that there are synergies between technology adoption and human capital, because on one end, for successful implementation of technology, you do need the human capital to support it and the necessary capability to ensure there's a successful implementation. But at the other end, it could also be that like because you have used the technology, somehow the capability gets augmented of the people who are interacting with it. So that is something that we want to study. And had we sort of focused on 2.0 or 3.0, that makes it much more difficult to study these individual level effects, because for the more complex form of analytics, the firm might need a data analytics team that they hire, or they might need to offload some of the work to the marketing or sales department, and that would just muddy our ability to study these individual level effects. So those are the two main reasons why we focused on 1.0. Moving to the literature, existing studies do try to explore this relationship between performance of the firm and adoption of analytics. But most of these studies are based on survey data and the publicly available financial data. And because of that, one could argue that there is self-selection going on in the firms that in fact do take up analytics and when they take up analytics. So there are these endogeneity concerns. The paper that is most close to us in spirit is by Berman and Israeli, and they actually have a quasi-experiment which they use to study the impact of a retail analytics platform on online retail firms, and they see staggered adoption of these retail firms into analytics, which they utilize to argue the causal effects. And they do find a positive impact of analytics adoption on the revenue of the firm. But there are some key differences between our study and theirs. Firstly, we focus on a much more entry-level analytics, as I'll describe more in the subsequent slides. But also we use an RCT, so to that extent we have causal results. And most importantly, we are trying to look at these individual level effects on the entrepreneur or the manager who's interacting with the technology. So this single decision maker setup makes it easy for us to identify the mechanism and speak more towards the individual effects of analytics. So given that context, we have 3 research questions that we are trying to answer in this paper. First is the main effect. What is the impact of analytics on firm performance? So by performance, we mean sales and profits of the firm. The second and the third research questions are more to do with these individual level effects, where the second research question is about how analytics impacts the individual manager's analytical ability, whoever is interacting with the technology, how does their aptitude change, if at all it does. And the third research question is on the exposure to marketing analytics leading to somehow change in the decisions that the entrepreneurs take, both within the marketing area, which is directly linked to the marketing analytics tool that we provide them, or if there are any spillovers to other functions as well. So we'll be exploring both of those questions. So those are the research questions, and I'll next move to the research design, which we set up to answer these questions, but I'll pause and see if we have any comments or feedbacks so far. Okay. Cool, so I can go on and describe the research design now. So as I mentioned, we ran a randomized controlled experiment in Rwanda with growth-oriented small-scale firms. We have a total of 550 of them, which we randomized into 3 groups. So the first group is the treatment group, which has 250 entrepreneurs, and they receive the marketing analytics tool, which is something that we designed, and I'll describe it more in the subsequent slides. We also give them a smartphone and internet connection, and all of this is free of cost that we provide them. Most of the firms in our sample did not have a smartphone to begin with. They had the simple phones without internet and stuff like that. So we also had hired analysts on the ground to train them to use the phone, to use the app, and sort of how to enter data into it and stuff like that. So that was the treatment group. Then we also had a placebo group of around 50 entrepreneurs, which just received the smartphone and internet access only. And this was a counterfactual group that we created to sort of rule out alternative explanations linked to smartphone access or internet access. And then finally, we have the control group, which again has 250 entrepreneurs, and they receive nothing. And we just at the end of the experiment, survey all of them to see if there are any differences amongst the groups. We conduct a baseline survey at the beginning, then there is 7 months of treatment, and finally at the end of 7 months, we conduct the endline survey. I'll be sharing results from all of them towards the end of the presentation today. Okay, so before I sort of describe the recruitment process that we had, just a bit about why we chose Rwanda, why small firms in Rwanda. So the first reason is because we wanted sort of this clean slate to begin with, where the firms don't have much access to analytics to begin with. And we wanted to exogenously sort of drop analytics for some firms and not for the others in order to answer the questions that we had. And Rwanda provided, small firms in Rwanda provided this setup where most of the firms in our sample are completely new to analytics, and we are sort of exposing them to it. And the second reason is the government push in Rwanda is very high for sort of making it the next Silicon Valley. They're very supportive of technology interventions, so it makes it easier to run these interventions in that country. Coming to the recruitment phase, we had this, I mean, we didn't really have any listing sources of firms to recruit in our sample. So we had to do it from scratch. So we hired about 20 RAs, which canvassed the streets of 3 cities in Rwanda. So Kigali, which is the biggest city. Then we had Muhanga and Musanze, which are also big cities of Rwanda. So they physically went door to door to recruit firms, and they reached out to about 15,000 firms in total. And at the end, we had a sample of 550 that we worked with. So this is just a flyer that we sort of used to advertise this particular project to the firms. And at the time, it was SMS-based solution that we were thinking. So it was it had some sort of old things in it, but this is what helped us to sign up the firms into the project. And once we sort of reached out to these 15,000 firms, at the end of it, we got about 2,500 workable recruitment surveys, which were like fully complete. And then we sort of filtered them on the basis of the entrepreneur age being above 18, them having a proper physical location for their business. And we calculated a GPI, growth potential index, based on these 10 variables. And we sort of selected the firms which were sort of higher up on these 10 variables, because that sort of signified that they were not the subsistence level firms, they were legitimate firms which were willing to explore new activities and innovations in order to grow their business. And that sort of provided the correct sample where we could introduce analytics and maybe something could happen to these firms. This is just some of the pictures of the firms in our sample. About 95% of our firms were retail, trade, and services. So, and the remaining 5% were like manufacturing, agriculture, but that was a smaller portion. Mostly it was these kinds of firms, which are tailors, confectionery stores, garment shops, kid stuff sellers, shoe shop, resto bars, and grocery stores. Those were the kind of firms in the sample that we were working with. And this is the field setup. As I said, we had the 20 analysts on the ground working with the firms. And then we had 2 team leaders and we had a research manager on the top. It was quite a big team, but it ensured that we could deliver a strong intervention at the end.
Robert,
Yeah.
may I have a question? So is it possible for the firms in the treatment group to communicate with firms in the control or principal firms? Like maybe I say, oh, it seems that marketing analytics tools is so cool. And then these control firms, maybe they don't get access to the marketing analytical tools you provide, but seeking for other tools because the idea, well, such a fantastic thing, we should also adopt that. Is it possible?
Yeah, I think that's a very genuine concern and how it could lead to satwa problems. But when we did the recruitment, we ensured that the recruitment happened in a way that we were like leaving 4 lanes for every sort of firm that we recruited in the sample to ensure that there is appropriate distance between them. But in the end, I can also show you some sort of robustness checks that we do to see if the control firms who have a treatment firm within 1 kilometer of its distance somehow have a different sales or profits as compared to firms that don't have that. So, and we don't see any different effects there. So, so we try to sort of ensure that doesn't happen in the recruitment process, and we also sort of test for it to the best that we can in the end. And I'll show you results in the end. But thanks, that's a very, very genuine question.
Cool, thank you. Yeah.
Okay, so next I'll describe the intervention and the app that we used for the delivery of this analytics intervention. So as I said, we designed this app from scratch along with the support of this company, a software company based in India. And so we had 4 different parts of this app, which were sales, products, customers, and marketing activities. So these 4 sort of topics were selected based on the key sort of topics which are covered in the core marketing courses in business schools. So that's how we selected these. And there were 2 parts to the app: data entry, which happened wherein the entrepreneur was entering data into the app. And then there was an output, which was the analytics output, which the app provided to the entrepreneur. And the output happened at the end of every month. Based on the data that was entered, it was displayed to the entrepreneur at the end of the month. So I'll first describe the data entry process, which you can see on this slide. So first, I'll go topic by topic for the 4 topics. So the first we had was sales. So in this section, the entrepreneur was supposed to enter whether or not the shop was open, and if yes, how much sales did they do that day. And this was at daily level. At every day, the entrepreneur had this sort of screen in the app. So the first question was your business operating today? If they answer yes, they then had to enter how much was the sales. So this is a very simple thing, hardly took them a minute or 2 on a daily basis. But then the more sort of bigger data entry points were on products, activities, and customers. And this happened at a bi-weekly level. So products and activities happened 1 week, and the following week it was to ensure that the entrepreneurs don't get overwhelmed with data entry. So looking at the product section, they had to sort of in this one write down which are the top 3 products that they sell. And for those top 3 products, what are the sales, price, and cost that they incur. So the question would be, what is your most popular product or service? And then when they enter that, the next question would be, how many units did you sell in the past 7 days? How much does a customer pay for this unit? So that way we could calculate the margin that they have when they also enter the cost. So the next section was activities, which was also entered along with products. Here they entered any marketing activities that they would have undertaken. So this included promotional activities or any interactions that they had with customers to understand about their sales needs or if they're satisfied with the product. So the questions would be, how many times did you ask people if they would like to see a new product or service, and they just had to enter that. And similarly, how many times did you do any promotions? If they didn't do, they could just enter 0. If they did, they just enter how many times they did that. So that was on the activities front. And finally, on the customers part, this was on the alternate week when they were not entering product and activity data. And here they, for the 3 customer segments of loyal customers, irregular customers, or new customers, along those 3 segments, entered the average basket size, the customer count, and how many customers sort of visited, purchased and visited the store. So I'll just sort of show some of the snapshots from the app here. So in the past 7 days, how many regular customers bought something from your business, and how much did a regular customer usually spend at your business? So they had those questions where they entered, clicked continue, and then they were done for that week. And we also had these notifications which the entrepreneurs would get. Suppose if the day was about to end and they still hadn't entered the daily sales data, the app would pop up a notification saying, please enter your sales data for today, to ensure that we have high compliance with data entry, because without the data, we couldn't really do any analytics on it. So that was the input part of the app. These are some of the screenshots of how the app looked. So this was the sort of first page where the entrepreneur was provided with a specific username and password, where they could just enter the app, and then they could select the language. Most of the people selected Kinyarwanda, the local language, and then there was some sort of basic entrepreneur information there. And finally, there was the business information on products, customers, activities, and sales. They could click on each of these tabs and they could enter the relevant information for that week or that day. Okay. And then we also had the output section in the app. This sort of activated at the end of every month with new data from the analytics of the data from that month. And again, it had 4 sections to it, similar to the input that was being provided to the app. So the sales part of it provided daily, weekly, and monthly sales trends. They could be presented in terms of tables, also in terms of graphs, to see how their sort of time period changes are happening in sales. The second part was products. Here we presented again weekly, monthly, product-wise volume, margin, and sales for the top 3 products that they had already entered through the month. Then they also have the customer section, where for those 3 customer segments I talked earlier about, which is loyal, irregular, and new customers, they were presented with average basket size, customer count, etc. And finally, a similar trend was shown for the activities that they're undertaken. These could be promotional activities or even customer interaction activities. So this is how the output looked in the app. And the first column and the second column here is sort of displaying the product, some of the product output. So in the first column, you can see that here the entrepreneur is able to see the month-on-month margin for the top 3 products on average, how it is changing. So for example, from July to August, it has dipped by around 10% or something like that, and then dipped again by 5% and then increased. And similarly, a similar trend can be seen for volume in this particular graph. And then on the second column, you can see the statistics for the current month that they are in. So for the top 3 products that they had entered, what is the price on average through the month, what was the margin, and what was the volume sold? And this is like a graph for that. In addition to this app sort of output that they're being provided, what we also did was create a PDF of all the analytics output from the app. And we took a printout of it and provided all the treatment entrepreneurs at the end of the month. So this was done because most of these entrepreneurs were not very accustomed to staring at screens for long periods of time. So the printout was perfect for them. And we also had the on-ground team to explain them wherever they were not able to understand how a particular metric was being calculated, because about 90% of our sample had never gone to college and 10% of our sample had not even had formal schooling. So they sometimes needed support to understand how the data that they were entering was getting converted into this sort of average value, or these statistics, how are they coming up. So as you can see here, this is sort of the sales output. They could see how many days they were open in the month, how much did they sell in total, and hence what was their average sales, and then how did this average sales change month on month. So they could see that how has the sales changed, how has the prices changed, and they could make correlations amongst those different things. And here on this side, this is a graph of the product-wise sales for the month. So for the top 3 products, this is a locking company for which this analytics report I'm showing you. So the first one is sort of how many duplicate keys did you make? Second one is, I think, installing a door locking system. Third one is also some kind of a locking service that it provides. So it could see, so the firm owner could see that in this month, how many times did I do each one of these? On average, how much did I do? And finally, this pie chart is about shows the sort of breakup of customers across the 3 customer segments. So for this locking company, most of its customers are these irregular, coming from this irregular customer bucket. So these are some of the things that were covered in the report, but there were other sort of simple statistics as well based on the input that they had provided. And at the end of the intervention, which went on for 7 months, each entrepreneur had been provided with 7 monthly reports, which happened from June to December 2019. And then in January 2020, we conducted our end-line survey. And I'll present the results of that survey next. Yeah, but I'll pause here to see if there are any comments or any questions. If not, I can go on to the results sharing section. Okay, I can go on to sharing the results. So we tested for balance between our sample at the baseline, and our sample was balanced. I can show you some of the variables there. So actually, I want you to just focus on two variables in this table. So the first one is the number of employees. And you can see that on average, the number of employees of our sample was around 0.5. So which is great because we didn't want, we wanted the single decision maker setup to be able to test how does the analytics tool impact the entrepreneur who's working with it. So given they did not have various other employees in the organization, that technology sort of interaction effect is sort of, we can identify that in our data. And the second metric, I think, which I want you to look at is the sales. So these numbers are in Rwandan francs, and one USD is around 938 Rwandan francs. So this converts to about $780, I guess. So on average, the sales at the baseline for our firms was around $780. So these are not big firms for sure, but they are having a decent revenue. They also have a proper physical location from which they work out of. So these are not like subsistence level firms. They are proper genuine firms that we were working with. Okay. So given our sample is balanced, I will now go on to show the results for the three research questions that we had sort of laid down earlier: the main effects on profits and sales, the mechanism in terms of the ability or aptitude impact of the entrepreneur interacting with the app, and the second mechanism in terms of any actions that the entrepreneur took differently, both within the marketing sort of function and also outside the marketing function. Were there any spillovers? So let's begin by looking at the main effects. So this is a graph which shows the profit trends across time for the firms in our sample. The green is treatment, the blue is control, and the vertical red line shows the sort of intervention start. So before this vertical red line, both the treatment and control are statistically indifferentiable in terms of their profits. But after this sort of red line, we see that treatment does better. So the fourth period is actually an average of the profits of the firm between October and December 2019. And the fifth period here is the final endline survey data collection that we did, and hence provides the January 2020 sort of profits for the firm. But we see that there are sort of upward trends in treatment, and it's doing better than control. And when we look at the sales information of these firms, again, we see that the treatment is doing better when it comes to comparison with control. And more formally, looking at the regression results, we see a similar story. So let's focus on the first column to begin with. So the mean of the control group was, these are in 1,000 Rwandan francs, all of these figures. So the mean of the control group was 454,000 Rwandan francs, which is roughly $480 or so. And the treatment was doing higher, was having higher sales by around 165,000 francs, which is around $175. So which is a treatment effect of around 36%. And I should add that we took an average of the sales for the fourth and fifth periods that I showed in the earlier slides, just to ensure that we are more conservative in the results that we are showing and not just sort of taking the final period into consideration. We also convert inverse hyperbolic sine transform to ensure we are not the effects are not being driven by outliers. And again, we see significance. And for profits, we do a similar thing here, and we see that the control profits were 85,000 Rwandan francs on average, and treatment was doing about 25,000 Rwandan francs higher, which is an effect size of around 29%. And to avoid multiple hypothesis testing, we created an index overall using all of these four metrics, and we see that index is significant. So in summary, we feel pretty convinced that there is a positive impact of Analytics 1.0, which is a very simple tool actually, but still we see a positive impact in performance for the sales as well as profits of the firms. And one more thing to notice, placebo is not really moving in a positive direction like treatment. So which convinces us that the effects are not being driven by the smartphone or the internet, it is actually the app that is causing the change. This is just a CDF to show how the sort of movement is across the entire sort of spectrum of firms. And we see across the entire spectrum, there is a movement of the green treatment curve towards the right. So the effects are not being driven by just one part of one sort of section of the firms. It's a overall movement towards the right of the curve. And we do these a host of robustness and intervention checks to convince ourselves that these results actually hold and these are not some sort of spurious effects that we are picking up. I want to share one of these, which is the attrition and firm survival checks here. So we see around 4% attrition in our sample at the end line. But as you can see, attrition is not systematic. It's sort of equally happening across treatment and control. But when it comes to survival, how many firms survived at the end, we see treatment firms are around 4% more likely to survive as compared to control. And that is actually encouraging to know that analytics adoption somehow impacted the survival of the firm as well. But the result that I showed you earlier includes all the firms, even the ones that did not survive. We also do similar sort of regressions for the firms conditional on survival. We see significant effects there also. Yeah, and I wanted to also share this sort of 0.9 here, which was the comment made earlier about do the control firms sort of interact with the treatment firms and does that lead to any sort of network effects? So what we did in this graph was, in this table, was compare those control firms which had a treatment firm within 1 kilometer of its radius to those control firms which did not have that, and see if their average sales profits were different. And we don't see a significant difference between the two. Okay, so at the end of this, I hope I have convinced you all that there are some positive effects of incorporating Analytics 1.0 for firms. And now I'll go on to sort of describing the mechanism that we have in mind and we tested for. So looking at the mechanism, we have sort of two parts that we are trying to check here. One is the entrepreneur aptitude, if there was any change in their ability, analytical ability, numerical reasoning. And the second is, did they take any different actions in their firm? So, so the idea here is, as I already had mentioned, that we have these single decision maker firms in our sample. So we want to understand how does the exposure to analytics change their numerical reasoning or analytical ability. And there are studies, existing studies, that show that if an individual has low numeracy, it could lead to biases in decision making. And this was mostly done in a healthcare context in terms of taking risks or making sort of more logical decisions regarding your health. And it was seen that for people who are low in their numeracy could lead to biased decision making, leading to sort of suboptimal outcomes. And there are also studies which show that better numeracy could actually end up, the individuals end up choosing better, higher utility options if they're just higher in their numeracy levels. And so given that context, what we want to check is two things. One, does the numerical and reasoning aptitude of the entrepreneurs involved change in any way? And second, does their sort of preference change towards data? Do they sort of start leaning more towards data-driven approaches than sort of gut-based decision-making? And to be able to sort of study these questions, we had a battery of psychological tests, objective psychological tests that we administered to the entrepreneurs in our sample. So these were sort of all the tests that we did. And to sort of explain how it looked like, I'll just look at the first column, which is the cognitive reflection test. it is, these are a set of questions which they are geared to understanding if the individual is sort of more intuition based in its in their reasoning, or do they sort of get more involved and think a bit more about it logically to arrive at the correct results. So to show you what the questions look like, these are the 3 questions in the cognitive reflection test. And these are not very simple questions, because if you look at the first one, a bat and a ball costs 110, the bat costs 100 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? So one might, by intuition want to circle 10 as the answer, but the correct answer is 5. So to that extent, these questions were slightly tricky, and they were sort of designed in a way to ensure that we are able to see if the person is more sort of gut-based in their response, or do they further reflect and get the answer. And these are like predetermined psychological tests. We did not come up with that. We are just using these tests. And we see that the control group score was 0.77 out of a score of 3, which was the maximum score. But the treatment is sort of 0.26 higher than the control. So if you add these two up, that's around 1. So on average, the treatment group got 1 answer right out of the 3, but the control did not even get that. So so clearly there is a sort of positive, significant movement for the treatment firms. And we see that across all the other tests that we did as well. And then the 5 and 6 were sort of more, or the numerical orientation test was more geared towards understanding the preference of the firms. Do they prefer data based stuff more, or do they prefer like words and stories more? So some of the questions in this one was, when reading the newspaper, how helpful do you find tables and graphs that are parts of a story? So just to understand, do they lean more towards data or not? And they provide a rating here. And again, we see even in the preference towards data, significant positive effects for treatment over and above the control. And again, to avoid multiple hypothesis testing, we have this overall index that we create, and we see that the treatment group is doing better in terms of control group, both in terms of whether they are more inclined towards using numbers, or they even have a higher aptitude, maybe to higher reasoning and numerical calculations. And I also want to add that this is not an attention story, that somehow the treatment firms are paying more attention or spending more time to solve these questions as compared to the others, because all of these questions were timed. They had a sort of 30-second timer attached within which they had to sort of provide the answers. And this was similar across treatment and control. Yeah, and also we see that placebo is not moving, which is also encouraging to see.
You have less than 10 minutes.
Cool, thanks. Okay, so I think by now we are slightly convinced that the entrepreneur aptitude has moved into a positive direction as a result of interacting with the analytics tool. And this is, I think, quite encouraging to see, because this is, to the best of our understanding, the first time any sort of ability-based changes have been identified as a result of exposure to analytics, which we think is very cool. And now we'll go on to the second level of the mechanism, which is on the actions that the entrepreneur took. So yeah, so coming to the second part of the mechanism, the sort of motivation to this is that there are existing studies in the firm development literature which show that adoption of best practices in management are very highly correlated with firm performance. So these are studies by Nick Bloom, McKinsey and Woodruff, which show that management practices across marketing, finance, etc., adopting these best practices actually could also lead to higher firm performance. And we believe that exposure to analytics could probably help the entrepreneurs make those best practice decisions across not just marketing, but maybe other functions as well. So this is just a snapshot of some of the activities that we tested for between the treatment and control group. So changing prices, improving or adding new products, monitoring inventory, inspecting product quality. And we see across all of these things, treatment group was higher as compared to control and placebo. And we see that some of these activities are sort of treatment firms are more probable to do that as compared to control. So these numbers should be interpreted as probability measures. So about on average control groups are 0.29 probable to change prices, but treatment is sort of 0.48 probable to change, 0.48 more probable to change prices. And similarly about inspecting products, monitoring inventory, and overall we see that this is significant. And these, all these sort of metrics that we are measuring are directly linked to the marketing analytics output that we were providing them. So there were pricing outputs there were product related outputs there was also how much purchases happened. So it also linked to this monitoring inventory output. So it seems that encouraging to see that they are sort of probably using those analytics data to make these changes in their business. And apart from the marketing related activities, we also look at sort of some of the other business related activities. And we want to see if there are spillovers to these other functions by any chance. So here are some of the snapshots of the sort of treatment group records that they are maintaining. So here you can see in the first column here, this is sort of the total revenue and cost on a weekly basis that the firm is incurring. So it's kind of like a mini income statement for the firm on a weekly level that is being created for all the products. Even though this is not something that was a part of the analytics tool, we did not tell them to do this, they were doing this on their own. And on the second column here, you can see a stock report that is getting prepared. And these are all the products that they have purchased, how much of it is there and what was the cost. So, so this was again something that the firms did on their own. We had not asked them to do this. So again, within the financial record keeping function, we sort of looked at some of the additional activities that the firms could be doing. So separating business finances from personal finances, creating an income statement, monitoring cash flow, creating future budget. So we see that all of these, again, seem to be significantly higher for the treatment group as compared to the other groups. So here we see for the treatment, there are sort of the average for the control group to separate business and personal finances is that they're around 0.4 probable to do that, but treatment group is around 0.37 more probable to do that. Similarly, creating income statement, creating future budget, we see similar trends, which sort of goes to show that not only are there changes that the firms are making within the directly linked marketing function to the analytics that they were doing, but there are also positive spillovers into these other functions of financial record keeping. And just to convince ourselves that these results actually hold, we do a host of other robustness checks. And we also look at some of the other unrelated business activities which we did not think would change as a result of analytics adoption. And these were like machine maintenance, process efficiency, competition research. Are you researching about what competition is around you? Are you providing receipts and invoices to your customers? So we didn't think that these things should change as a result of analytics because they didn't seem linked much and they don't change as well. So it sort of provides discriminant validity to our measures that, that they are valid. Yeah, so again, at the end of this, I hope I have convinced you to think that analytics can not just lead to positive changes in the functions that they are directly sort of linked to, but also could have spillovers to these other functions. And I just wanted to go on to the conclusion. I'll pause for a minute to see if there are any questions or comments till now. Otherwise, I can move on to conclusion.
3 minutes.
Cool. Okay, so this is just a cost benefit back of the envelope calculation that we did for the firms. And I have not added the fixed cost of the app development here, because if we have like a big enough section of firms adopting it, that cost would be pretty low. So I've not included that. There are only variable costs here of server and maintenance, the field staff cost for explaining and sort of downloading the app for the firms, and finally the data and phone cost. And even after including all of these costs, we see that a total benefit of around $13 per firm. And for a firm which is earning around $100 per month, $13 could be a significant positive amount, which is encouraging to see. Just now going to the contributions and summarizing the conclusion, I think the first contribution that we make is on the main effects to show that Analytics 1.0, which is a very simple tool, a very simple technology, could have a positive, significant impact on the firm performance, on their sales as well as profits. The second, on the mechanism front, I hope I've convinced you to show that analytics adoption can also lead to a positive impact in the analytical aptitude of the people who are involved with the app and interacting with the app. And again, this is like the first time, to the best of our knowledge, that something like this is being shown. And secondly, we also show that there are positive business actions that the firms are taking as a result of exposure to analytics, not just within the product and customer areas which are directly linked to the analytics tool, but also spillovers into other financial record keeping activities. And finally, on the measurement side, we use, instead of self-report for measuring this analytical aptitude of entrepreneurs, we use these objective tests to measure the entrepreneur aptitude changes, which we think provides more robustness to the results that we are sharing. So with this, I think I'll conclude. And that's all I had. Thanks for being so patient with listening. And if there are any questions or comments that you can think of later on, feel free to please email me. I'll leave my email ID in the chat section.
Great job, Rupali. Thank you for inviting me to discuss this paper. My name is Ayelet Israeli. I'm at Harvard Business School. Just before getting into it, I just wanted to say I really like the paper. I've seen an early version of it, but it was great to read the full version and see all the efforts that were done. The paper is very, very clear. The paper has a lot of robustness. I think Rupali demonstrated some of it, but there is a lot more, very transparent. So I encourage you to read it. And now I'll share some of my comments. So just thinking about the contribution of this paper. So like Rupali said, and I want to emphasize this, is that most analytics adopting small firms, even in the US and in other developed economies, adopt just very simple descriptive analytics and KPIs. So we tend to think about, very advanced analytics, about prescriptive and predictive and how you should use machine learning to do fancy things. But most managers and most firms just use very basic descriptive analytics. And in Rupali's case, it's even more basic than what we call descriptive analytics. It's just encouraging people to record their data and information when they're talking about Analytics 1.0. So it's really an important question on its own to understand whether descriptive analytics have any value. It's especially important in developing countries, like the paper and Rupali sets out, when you want to help these micro entrepreneurs actually have a better life, and when you have all of these NGOs and initiatives to help them to do so. So what is nice about this paper is that it's the first one to actually have randomization that allows a pretty clean causal measurement of the impact of Analytics 1.0 adoption. Almost in every other case, we have all of these issues, even if analytics tool was offered randomly, there are issues around take rates and whether people actually adopt it and how much they use it. But here with the careful design, we have that. And in the sample, the first good news is that it has positive impact both on sales and on profits, which is consistent with previous work, but also adds new information that it's not just that you get more revenues because you are just discounting and getting more people in, but you're actually impacting profits as well. And then in addition, there is a really nice insight into how this affects the actual entrepreneurs. I think Rupali talked about this a lot, but it improves their analytical abilities. and business practices above and beyond marketing actions. So we see their improvement in other fields as well in these spillovers. And most of these measures are objective, which also help with the validity and convincing that this is actually what's going on. So here are some suggestions. So if we think about the intervention here, and as described in the different slides, is kind of smartphone plus marketing analytics 1.0. And I think Rupali showed this. So this kind of indicates that there are a lot more different things of what is this marketing analytics 1.0. So what does this include? It includes training. The analyst actually comes and explain how you would use a smartphone, how you would use an app, what do you see in the app. Then the analyst has weekly visits. Then they also contact you to ensure that you didn't miss any daily or weekly data entry. Then they also come at the end of every month and deliver hard copy results and explaining the data matrix in it. Importantly, they don't tell you what to do with it, but they still do all of these different things. On the entrepreneur side, other than the smartphone and the app, they have to do all of this data entry, both on a daily level and the weekly level. And we also have these notification or app reminders that Rupali was talking about. So we have here, what really is this marketing analytics intervention? It includes the app, the smartphone, the training, the weekly tracking, the reminders, and the visits. So it's a lot of different components, and all of them together caused all these causal effects that were shown. But ideally, of course, we would like to disentangle the different elements of the intervention. So of course, in an ideal world where we can run as many placebos as we want, we would have one where some people only get the app, but no analyst or no follow-up, or some only get analyst training, but they don't actually get the app and they're only doing pen and paper. Of course, this is very difficult and costly. We already have a case of pretty heroic measures where they follow people for many years. They have people on the ground. They provide all this access. There is app development. There's a lot going on already. So my suggestion is to try to look at the existing data to perhaps do some of this. For example, maybe one of the analysts was sick one day, missed some of the visit. Maybe this creates some variation. Maybe someone could turn off notifications and didn't get a reminder. Does it affect these people differently? Another thing that appears in the paper, but of course Rupali didn't have time to talk about, is there are about 100 firms that actually did record their sales or their profits or both at baseline. And the fact that we see, even for these smaller sample and even after power issues, some significant, maybe some of them are marginal, but positive and significant effect, it suggests that the benefit is more than just the mere recording, but there's something additional in the intervention that has this positive impact. And maybe we can celebrate that result as we try to kind of tease apart what is actually the actual intervention that has this impact. Still, it's very important contribution, but it's harder to kind of dissect the different elements. The second thing that we see here in the mechanism is all of these tests and what they call the analytical aptitude of the entrepreneurs is improved. One interesting thing here is that all of the measures are objective except for two. I can give you just one guess which of these two there are, and it's of course the two highest ones, which to me was very interesting because it also shows to me, and maybe this is just my interpretation, that there is some kind of a self-perception or confidence or something that the people that have the training feel, or you're empowering them or something like that. Although it's very nice to see that all of the measures improved. So it's not just their own perception, but of course their own perception is double, triple, 5 times some of the other measures. I have also some questions about the mechanism. The first question is if we can leverage these 100 firms that previously recorded sales and profits to better understand the mechanism, to see if, for example, and I understand there could be power issues, but maybe for this group, we can see that the only change is in the actions and not in the aptitude because they already had analytical aptitude or something like that to help us better understand how it would affect different entrepreneurs. And then there is one thing that is a little surprising is that despite the fact that the placebo group is much smaller and standard errors are larger, we have this issue where there's a positive change, where there are actually positive changes of the marketing actions also in the placebo group. So I'd like to better understand why the placebo group also tries to change prices and improve or add products and these type of activities where they were only given a smartphone and none of the other things. So all in all, I think it's a really great paper. There's additional very cool results that Rupali didn't talk about that after all of this COVID closures, entrepreneurs going out of business, they were able to find randomly 14 entrepreneurs and interviewed them. 13 out of them actually still used analytics, and a lot of them realized value from analytics even throughout the pandemic. There is the full transcript, and we see that, for example, the simple intervention where they ask people to figure out who are their loyal customers and have a list of your loyal customers turned out to be really important because it allowed them to connect with and deliver supplies and essential materials to these loyal customers during COVID closures. So it looks like there's really kind of a CRM impact here and not just kind of simple math or changing prices or something like this, but really understanding something about relationship with customer. So good luck with this great paper, and thank you again for inviting me to discuss it.
Thanks, Ayelet. That was very helpful, and I'll keep some of the points you made in mind, and hopefully we can address some of them in the next version of the paper. Thank you.
We have additional 5 minutes. Are there any more questions? If not, we could proceed to the third presentation this afternoon.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen. Give me a moment. Is my screen visible?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So hi, everybody. Good evening, and thank you for coming to this presentation on a Friday evening. I really appreciate it. I'm Ishita Chakraborty, and I'm an assistant professor in UW-Madison. And this project is an extension of one of my dissertation papers. It's joint work with Kai Cheong and Howard Dover, two professors at UT Dallas, and my dissertation advisor, K. Sudhir. And I would take this opportunity to thank everybody at UT Dallas for making this project possible. So what is this project about? The title says AI and AI human-based salesperson hiring using interview videos. So what we have seen in recent years is AI has become pervasive in hiring. There's a lot of interest in automating different hiring related processes, and the main interest is coming more or less for cost saving reasons. Some reports say that the average cost per hire metric in US have gone as high as $4,000. As a result, in response to this, what we have seen is this little cottage industry of lot of AI tools which try to automate different stages of the hiring process. Some of it could be something as simple as scheduling interviews or just sending reminders to different people who are in the interview process. But some of these tools have also started doing something more than that: resume screening, text-based matching, as well as analyzing small videos like video resumes and so on. So in short, there's a lot of interest and a lot of opportunity in this space. And this is one interesting article which came in 2019, but very much relevant even now. For example, one of the companies, HireVue, their AI-driven data assessments have become so pervasive that universities now are making special efforts to train students on how to look, how to speak for best results. And this is something I often hear from our undergrad students too. Some of them are even tense that they don't know what is HireVue doing and how those, what they do is going to impact whether or not they're going to be selected for an internship. Even currently, HireVue is currently being used in close to 700 companies, some large companies like GE, Unilever, and Delta. So on one hand, when we see a lot of opportunity in this domain, there are also rising concerns about what are these applications exactly doing behind the back. And there are several states which have now laws which ban the use of AI-related hiring tools. If these tools cannot explain that what is driving the performance or what is driving the scores that candidates are getting out of these apps. So there are both there is both a lot of opportunity in this space and also some rising concerns. So to summarize, this is the state of art of AI-based recruitment. There are a lot of industry tools. There's also some academic research. For a long time, most of it was focused on resume screening. Now, some of these tools have started incorporating short videos. This is essentially problematic because when you reduce humans to resumes, a lot of unobservables are lost. What we don't usually see, or something that is not well studied, is analyzing or evaluating interactive videos, for example, real interviews. And this is especially important in domains like sales and marketing, for example, because this is a domain where people highly value social skills like critical thinking, question answering. And so unless we have an interactive two-way communication and videos of those, we are not really able to analyze these kind of skills. The third point here is that these are all high-stake decisions, and who you hire will have a long-term impact, not only on the firm, on the person, but also the labor market. So there is an increasing push to understand these high-stake decisions, and this is where many commercial applications are still not able to do that really well. Many of them are black boxes. And finally, even if everything is done right, this is just a domain where there will always be some resistance to sole use of AI, or for example, AI doing everything, because it's just a sensitive domain and people are never going to be comfortable that AI is taking all these hiring decisions by itself. So there is and there will be a need for human intervention in the near future. And the question is that we know that there is some degree of human input that is important, but where is the intervention most important, and what exactly is this intervention doing that the AI by itself is not able to do? So this is our motivation, and this brings us to our research questions. And so the first question is, how can we use recorded interactive videos to develop a model of salesperson skill prediction? And our research question is very much only in the salesperson hiring domain. The second question that we are seeking to answer is, at which hiring stage should AI be used? So there are several stages in a hiring process. The two key stages are an initial screening stage and the final selection stage. And a screening stage is primarily about figuring out that who are the worst people and who you should eliminate, who you don't want to waste time on, whereas selection stage is where you're making the final hiring decision. When it was only resumes, and when AI-based hiring was more about resume screening, it was often used for screening alone, that is figuring out who are the worst candidates. But now that we have access to video data and we have the ability to analyze and learn from this data, can we use AI for something more serious like selection? The third research question is around trying to understand that what is driving the decisions of the AI model. And so, for example, if these are videos, it is multimodal data. So we are observing what the person is saying, how they are saying. Also, we are observing body language, vocal elements. So which of these are actually driving the decisions of the AI? And this also has implications for what type of data firms should collect, store, and analyze, because there are also a lot of privacy implications of storing this kind of data for long-term, actual interviews of people. It's much harder than just storing the text or the transcript of the interview. So we want to understand what is driving the decisions of the AI and which type of data is important to collect. And finally, coming to our fourth point, that there is broad agreement that human intervention is needed, but how and when should human judgment be incorporated in the decision-making process? So these are the 4 research questions that we want to address using this research, and very quickly how this maps to the existing literature in this space. And we connect to these 2 strands of literature. Both are very rich. There is a big literature on in HCI, human computer interaction, and CS, which is around human AI hybrid models. And this literature is spread across several domains, because there are many domains where full automation is not an option, because there is a lot of ambiguity and you would always need some human intervention to help the machine do its job, for example, medical diagnosis. And there is a subpart of this literature which is more in the management space, which is around integrating AI with organizational decision making. And this literature, though very interesting, is very theoretical and it needs empirical testing. And more specifically, we think that it needs there needs to be more domain specific testing of many of the things which are proposed in this literature. The second stream of literature that we connect to is this rich marketing and sales literature on not just recruitment, but sales influence tactics. And this is a pretty broad stream of literature, but mainly survey based. And what's lacking here is, though there's an understanding of high level tactics, it's very difficult to actually figure out that which low level behaviors actually lead to success. And that's because there was never availability of frame by frame video data, the kind of data that we have, which enables us to actually create variables out of these micro behaviors and study their impact on the success of this process. So just to summarize, these are the 3 contribution areas that we are seeking. We want to develop a video-based decision tool for salesperson hiring. We want to use explainability methods from machine learning to open this black box of the actual process of a sales interview. And this is pretty important because even the existing literature in this domain has time and again told that there is a limited understanding of what really happens during a buyer-seller interaction. So we often see outcome variables and some surveys done at the end, but there's a need to understand that what really happened during the process. And finally, we want to assess the value of human AI hybrid models in sales recruitment and illustrate a cost-efficient manner of AI deployment in this scenario. Before I move to the actual setting and data, I'll just give a snapshot of the results. Some of these terms might not be super clear right now, but hopefully at the end of the presentation, this will make more sense. So the first set of results is, what do we learn about what factors impact success in sales interviews? One of the key results is that when it comes to eliminating the worst candidates, the AI models tend to give a lot of importance to audiovisual features. For example, do you have an energetic voice? What kind of a posture do you have? But when it comes to selecting the top candidates, interactivity, listening, turn-taking conversations, being more precise and quantitative in your linguistic style, these things matter much more. Then on the other hand, so this is the set of results from the human AI hybrid model. What we learn is that the hybrid model does outperform the AI-only model, and it reaches close to the human panel benchmark. And I'll be talking about the benchmark when we reach there. But overall, it's doing better. And even adding just one human in the loop is making the selection accuracy better by 15%. And what we also find is that there is an added cost of having a human in the loop, and this cost is only justified for making the final selection decision. Whereas if it's only about screening out the worst candidates, it's probably okay to have just the AI model. And the other result that we have, and we are still investigating the mechanism of what is driving this result, is that human input seems to be most critical for judging the initial first 3-4 minutes of the interview. But, and I'll talk about the stages of the interview and then it'll become more apparent. But what we find is humans are very good at judging initial rapport building, and the human input does not seem to make a lot more difference when it comes to the other stages. With that, I'll move to the setting and data. So our data is basically 195 interview videos, which are coming from an intern hiring drive from a university, and each interview spans around 20 minutes of interaction. So even if it's just say 200 interviews, it's actually 4,000 minutes of rich audiovisual content. And that's a lot of data because we can now analyze every frame and every reaction that happens in these 4,000 minutes. Every interaction here is a real sales interview. So I'll talk a little bit about the setting, because I might use the terms interviewee, interviewer, and buyer seller interchangeably, and that can lead to confusion. So what's happening here is it's a sales interview where there are students on one side who are seeking an internship, and on the other side there are industry experts who are looking for interns. So the setting is essentially a real interview, but what goes within the interview is a sales role play. So the interview itself consists of a sales role play where the student is a seller and the industry expert is a buyer, and the job of the student is to sell a CRM software to the buyer. So here seller basically means the person who is giving the interview, and buyer is the industry expert who is doing the interview. Further, what happens is that every interview is judged by a panel of 9 to 10 expert judges, and these are all subject matter experts. They are themselves like sales professional or HR professional in different industries. So basically, though it's one interview, we have essentially 9 to 10 scores coming from 10 different subject matter experts. And the picture here is how the actual setting looks like, and the table on the right hand side gives a little bit of breakdown on the demographics of the interviewers and the interviewees. So what we can see here is that there is a good balance of both genders, male and female, there in both the interview and interviewers, as well as when we look at the background of the people who are conducting the interview, there are a mix of people. So there are high experienced people, so which basically means they have more than 10 years of experience in sales. There are also low and middle experienced people, and the same goes for judges. And we also looked at their background in more detail, and we found there's a good mix of sales professional and HR professionals. So this is the data setting. I'll just wait and see if there are any questions on the data setting. I don't see anything in the chat, so I'll just move. Yeah.
Can you mention more on the outcome? Is it like given a score or several dimensions that the judges can rate?
Yeah, I'm coming to the outcome. So you're right. It's several dimensions, and I'll talk in detail about how the rating happens.
Okay.
Yeah.
So do we have any like the outcome measures and the real performance for this intern in the once they get admitted? Because I'm just wondering, what's in my mind is that it's possible that it's possible that one person behave really well in an interview, but when it comes to a real performance, then it's a little bit messy, or they didn't perform very well. And then when we think about hiring, what we really want to hire is to kind of those ones who can really perform good in the field, and maybe we can filter out some like the fuzzy stuff in their interviews, and then select those true ones. That's why I asked whether we have any measures related with
So yeah, to your question, so we don't have any long-term measures of how they do after they get the job, but that's pretty much for every interview. So when we give job interviews, the assumption is we'll turn out to be good professors. If that happens or not, we don't know for sure. So your question is well taken, and that's a problem in this whole literature and this field. But in our setting, we are basically trying to find that, who are the people who are doing well in the interview. So the judges give them a score, and the total score determines whether or not they land the internship. So that's where this setting ends.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah, so this is a little bit more detail into how the judges are doing their evaluation. So this setting is based on a national collegiate sales competition, which is sales collegiate competition that's happening for 22 years now. And most schools which have like sales courses and sales majors send their students to participate in this contest, and they have defined certain criteria for what defines success in sales, and the judges are basically making their decisions based on a similar criteria. So this is how the scorecard looks like. There are these 5 stages: approach, need identification, demo, objection handling, and closure. And these are some questions, and on a scale of 1 to 10, they're supposed to rate students on these questions. So it starts with approach, where it's about, how was your introduction? Are you able to gain attention, build rapport, and so on? And I'll not go into each of these questions, but just to give an understanding, need identification is about have you been really able to understand the buyer, and have you been able to uncover needs? The demo stage is pretty interesting, and what we see in the videos is, how people do these demos differs a lot across people. And what they're trying to figure out from the demo stage is whether you have talked about benefits, not just benefits of the product, but can you connect the benefits to the needs, how logical you were, how convincing you were, and so on. And then there's an objection handling stage, which is the fun part, where there are where the interviewers raise a lot of objections, and the student's job is to answer these objections effectively. And then there is a closure stage, and the judges also give some overall scores, like how persuasive you were in closing the deal, how are your communication skills overall. So that is not dependent on just one particular stage, but that's an overall score. Likewise, there are overall scores on enthusiasm and product knowledge. So this is a standard scorecard, which is used in NCSC, and our judges also use the same scorecard. And so this is the data setting, and now I'll talk about what kind of model we are building. So our model part actually has 2 elements. So one is an AI model to predict salesperson skill from objective features derived from video data. And there are 3 subparts into the AI model. The first one is around feature extraction. So this is video data, but how do we extract meaningful features from this data to get higher order variables, which are actually known to impact sales and persuasion. The other element of this model is a testable benchmark. So what are we comparing the performance of the model against? And finally, defining relevant metrics for model evaluation. So this is one part of the model. And the second model we have is a AI human hybrid model, which incorporates human judgment with the AI score. And I'll get into each of these models one by one. So the AI model basically consists of breaking down this video data into these 3 modalities. So the video data has visuals and audio on it. And what we do is we also convert it into transcripts. So we have the transcripts of this conversation. And the kind of features we're trying to extract from these 3 modalities is, for example, from the transcripts, we want to know the content and linguistic style. From the audio data, we want to understand how was your vocal style like, which could include how fast you talk, the pitch, voice modulation. And also from the visual data, we are mainly trying to study body language. One limitation of this data is because here the 2 parties are facing each other. So we did not have like full visibility of facial features. So we do lose out on seeing things like smiles, and that's a limitation of this data, but we have good visibility of hand gestures and body movements and postures and those kind of elements. So just like, there are 3 modalities of features, also drawing upon the previous literature in sales and influence tactics, we also group the features into 3 other ways. So there are 3 modalities, and then there are these 3 types of features, so as to say. So the first type is to do with, is about content. So basically what you say. The other is to do with style or how you say, and style could be coming from any of the modalities. There's a language style, there's a vocal style, and hand gestures, body language, that's also a component of style. And aside from these two, there are also interactivity elements, and that is what makes this data set special, because it's a two-way interaction. We can also measure things like how long one person talks, share of voice, turns, what's the median length of monologues. So these are like two categories of features or high level features that we want to extract from this data. And now I'll be talking a little bit about the feature extraction process. So in terms of content, so because it was a kind of a standard role play where the scenario is same for every student. So there is not much variation in choice of topics, but there is variation in how much time a person decides to spend on every topic. And so the content here, the operationalization of the content term is basically figuring out that what proportion of time was spent on a topic, and we use a topic model on LDA to figure out the top level topics that are being discussed. And what you see in table 4 is these topics are very much in line with the different stages of the conversation itself. So for example, if it's approach stage, the topics are around greetings and pleasantries. As you move to demo, there is more talk of technology than anything else, and there are words like security, cloud. When you move to objection handling, it totally shifts to pricing as well as challenges. So most of the clients raise a lot of challenges, like, you know, how much downtime will we have, how difficult it is to train our people, because it's a CRM software. So essentially they'll have to retrain their people to learn some new things and so on. And likewise, I'll not spend too much time on this, but we also look at specific linguistic styles, which have been shown in the past literature to impact persuasion in general and sales persuasion in particular. For example, something like linguistic power is shown to be highly associated with a person showing competence, assertiveness, and credibility. And all these things have also been shown to have a relationship with whether or not you're good at sales persuasion. And it manifests in our data in different ways. So for example, assertiveness manifests like being sure, saying things like sure, definitely, or lack of hesitation. And there are existing style dictionaries like LIWC, which cover some of these elements, whereas some elements are unique to our setting. So we extend those existing dictionaries and make sure we are able to have things specific to our setting, like politeness or competitive edge. So these are things which people like to see in salespeople. So you have a winning spirit, you're optimistic, you're polite, and so on. So in our paper, we give a more detailed description of these style elements. But now I'll talk about the body language bit. And how do we go about extracting gestures from video data? We use an open source software called OpenPose to extract low-level pixel locations of different body parts at frame level. So what it means is, because it's video data, we can divide it into frames. Every frame is 25 seconds. And OpenPose has certain advantages. So one, it's an open source software, so we have full interpretability on what's going inside, what features are getting generated. In fact, we are the ones defining the features on top of the low-level pixel locations that OpenPose gives. And OpenPose is especially good at disentangling features belonging to different users in the same frame. So what it means is, in our frame, we have two different people. So there is a buyer and a seller, and it allows us to actually say that which body or which feature, which gesture belongs to the buyer and which belongs to the seller. Just a little bit of background on how OpenPose works. It was developed by the Robotics Institute at Carnegie Mellon University. And the main idea is that there are different key points in a human body. For example, head, shoulder, elbow, left hand, right hand, the beginnings and the mid of the left and right hand. So these are called as key points. And what OpenPose allows us is to extract specific key points and link it to a particular individual. And the whole idea is it does it bottom up and real time. So what does bottom up mean? So when we look at pose estimation techniques, there are several pose estimation, and by pose estimation, I mean is, figuring out what's your hand gesture like, or what's the distance between your hands. So the two dominant ways of doing is a top-down approach and bottom-up approach. And a top-down approach is one where the software first tries to figure out where the person is located, a person locator, and then it tries to map a particular gesture or pose to the person. But these approaches often fail when there are multiple people in the frame. So sometimes they're just lost in person detection, and then the pose estimation, just halts. But bottom-up approaches like OpenPose have this advantage that they actually first start as figuring out that which are the poses or gestures or key points they can detect. That's the first stage. And they do it through convolution neural networks. And in the second stage, there are actually part affinity fields, which are non-parametric programs to detect the association between the part and the person. So essentially, you first figure out the part, the key points, and then you try to associate it with a particular person. And the fun part is that it allows you to actually detect 135 key points. Now, going back to our data, like we cannot really detect 135 key points, because if you see how these people are placed, we are more likely to detect features which are related to hands, to the posture, whether they're leaning forward or leaning backward, and also do they have head movement. So these are features which are more easily detectable from our data. So what we can do is, using OpenPose, we can create higher order variables of interest from the key points that are detected using OpenPose. And for us, the higher order variables of interest were things like hand gestures, posture, and face movements. And just to give an overview of how we define these variables. So for example, a variable could be distance between hands. So it's essentially the distance between these two key points, left and right wrist. So there is a key point attached to each of this, and the distance between that gives the distance between hands. What we do is we calculate average and variance across each frame for each of these variables. So, and why we do that? Because by calculating, for example, on an average, what is the distance between your hands, you get an idea of, on an average, how a person is using her hands, but also the variance gives you an idea of how long you have, for how long you have a wide open hand gesture, whereas, for how much time you have, something like clenched hands or things like that, because these are things which are known to impact how people perceive both the person as well as the message. So having open hand gestures versus closed hand gestures, changing your posture a lot. So if you have frequent head movements or torso movements, then essentially those are signs of nervousness or not being honest with the other person, and so on. So the calculating the average and variance across these different features allows us to construct these higher order variables of interest. And we also calculate these variables stage wise. So we calculate so there are different stages in the conversation, like demo, need identification, and we basically calculate these variables for each stage. That's what we do with respect to body language. And the next class of features is to do with vocal style and interactivity. And vocal style features are primarily derived using PyAudio library. There are also some recent papers like which have used the similar approach to construct features like speed of talking, voice energy, pauses, voice modulation. And the interactivity features basically can be constructed from any of the other modalities. So we construct them from audio and text. So there are features like number of turns in the conversation, where a turn is when I speak and I give the chance to the other person to speak. So identifying how many turns are there in the conversation. What is the share of voice? So how long is the buyer speaking versus the seller speaking? And what's the median length of monologues? So, and why these features matter, because some of the conversations have a lot of monologues, which means just one person keeps talking for long. And those conversations are essentially less successful than the ones where there is more turn taking and where the share of voice is kind of more uniform. I'll just pause briefly here to monitor the chat. I don't see anything, but feel free to just stop me and ask any questions. If you have, yeah.
May I have another question? So here the features is the average level in the whole video, or sometime changes across the whole, I mean the interviews.
Yeah, so we have taken averages across stages. So it's not exactly one feature for the whole video. Also, it's not like, it's not like features for every 1 minute, but we have grouped them based on the stages in the video. So need identification, objection handling, and so on.
Oh, I see.
Okay, I don't know. Okay, fine. So that was about feature extraction. And now what's a benchmark for model comparison? So just to remind everybody, so we are trying to construct an AI model that's able to predict salesperson skill. And so there has to be some benchmark to measure how a salesperson is doing. And usually the benchmark is the average of a human rater. So in our case, we have 9 to 10 judges who are each giving scores on different dimensions. So it could be okay to just average out and take an average of the human judges. In this case, we thought of another benchmark, which we called as candidate ability score. And this is not very different. Essentially, what it basically means is because we have this panel data where the same interviewer is taking multiple interviews. So I think I didn't mention this before. So in our setting, essentially a student is there in just one interview, but the interviewer is taking multiple interviews and the judges are also all judging multiple interviews. So basically we have a panel data from the interviewer and the judge side, and we are trying to tease out students' ability separate from the interviewer effect and the evaluator effect. And we call this candidate ability score. And we found that this metric is slightly better than the average judge score metric. We also work with that metric. And what I mean by better, I'll not go into a lot of details, but we ran some comparisons like if you use this metric versus that metric, what is the proportion of men versus women who get selected? And we found that the candidate ability score results in a better gender balance and certain other things and because of which we decided to go with this metric. But we also did comparisons with the average judge metric, which is an acceptable metric in the industry where, a lot of interviews, it's essentially 5 people interview and people take an average of the 5 opinions and decide that who should be hired. So this is just now, summarizing how our whole AI model looks like. And then I'll talk about, which metrics we choose to focus on. So we began with features. We extracted some features from the data, from the video data. Those features are essentially helping us to predict this candidate ability score. And then using the score, we want to rank people. And the idea is that, once we have a ranking of people, we can then say that who should be screened and who should be selected. So for example, top 10 could be screened out, top 10 could be selected and bottom 20 could be screened out, something like that. And so essentially what we have done is we have converted this continuous variable prediction problem, so which was trying to predict a score from the features into a more binary classification problem, which allows us to use many of the metrics which are normally used for binary classification problems like hit rate or accuracy, but instead we use balanced accuracy as a metric because many of our data sets are because our data set is imbalanced. So for example, in the screening data set, if you're trying to screen out the bottom 10, then there will be most people will be in the class 1 that they are not screened, and very small number of people will be in class 0 who are actually screened. So because of that, we decide to go with the balanced accuracy metric. We also define a screening error rate metric because essentially the purpose of screening is to make sure that it leads to good selection. So that's why we define a screening error rate metric, which basically calculates that what is the proportion of candidates in top X percentile as per the ground truth that we have, who are screened out according to predictive models. So this metric basically tells us that how good the screening was in the first place, if the screening allows us to basically reduce errors as we move to selection stage, because selection is conditional on screening. So basically if a person has not been screened out earlier, then that person will move to the selection stage. So that concludes the discussion of our AI model, the features, the metrics, and the benchmark that we are going to use. And we have another model where we want to combine the judgment of the AI or the scores of the AI with the scores given by a human. And so I'll talk a little bit about what the hybrid means in this context. And what I want to say is there could be different ways of thinking about an AI human hybrid model. And this is just one of the ways that we choose to do it in this paper. So the way we think about it is there is an AI component or AI score, which you can think of as a distribution of AI predictions using all the video features that we have got. So if this is the prior, then then how we think of the hybrid is now think of a random draw from the distribution of human judges. And basically what we'll try to do is using a Bayesian update, we'll try to update the AI score with the human judges score to arrive at an AI human hybrid score. And what it essentially comes out to is a weighted average of, so the AI human hybrid score is a weighted average of the score given to the human judge and the score given to the, it's a weighted average of the AI score and the human score. And what we essentially have to determine is how much weight do we place on each of these judgments. And how do we arrive at these scores is, we can think of these scores just like as other hyperparameters, which can be set via cross-validation procedure. So what we want, so when we basically try to figure out that, which is the score which leads to a better screening error rate, which improves selection accuracy, and what improves screening accuracy. And that is the score that we fix. And that's a weight that we put on the human element and the AI element. I don't know how I'm doing on time. I think I have 10 minutes, 15 minutes. So I'll talk about the results now. So I'll map the results to the research questions that I talked about earlier. So our first
Ishita, just quick clarification. So on the previous slide, HIJ is 10 or is it some score?
It is some score.
I see. So it's not a binary. It's not a binary thing.
No, it's not binary.
Yeah. So here I'll map the results to the research questions that we had earlier. So should AI be used? Yes.
May I ask another question? So for the human AI combination part, so about the scores, do you use all the samples to derive the distribution, or there's some split in terms of the training test validation? Which part is used for which components? Can you elaborate more?
Yeah, so it's basically the test part, because so if you think of the hybrid, it's basically once you have built the AI model, then how much more can you improve its accuracy by adding a human input? So the training data has to be kept separate from that.
Okay, it's not from the training data. It's another part of the data that derive this distribution and then to add it into the components. Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah. So the first research question was, should AI be used for screening or selection? And so what we see here is, the performance of our AI models are pretty reasonable when it comes to both screening as well as selection. They do slightly better at screening, around 61% screening accuracy and around 5 to 11% screening error rate. Now, how do we know that how good this is? So we go back to some benchmarks in existing literature, mostly in CS literature, that predict complex constructs like persuasion. One challenge is, unlike something like sentiment analysis or emotion analysis, where we have some well-defined benchmarks and that keeps updating like every year. So for complex constructs like persuasion, we don't have well-established benchmarks as of now, but what we get is pretty close to these current papers, which also predict similar things like persuasion. And the other thing we observe is that, we are also interested to know that whether the AI model is good at predicting objective as well as subjective elements of the score. And what do I mean by objective and subjective? So some elements of the score are more objective than the others. For example, how good you were at need identification or objection handling. There are some elements of the score are more subjective, like persuasion, confidence, and so on. And we don't see a lot of difference difference in how good or bad the AI model is at predicting the objective as well as subjective elements. In fact, it's quite good at predicting confidence scores, for example. Then the other research question that we were interested is to understand that what is really driving the decisions of this AI. And to do that, we look at some global interpretation measures. So what it means is just trying to understand that which features that go into the model are driving the final outcome of the model. And we do this analysis in two ways. So we first divide the features into text, audiovisual, interactivity. So we have kept interactivity separate from text and audiovisual because it's not linked to one particular modality. And what we find is, so when it comes to the screening outcomes, the audiovisual measures were far more important than text or interactivity. But when it comes to the selection decision, the text becomes much more important. Then we also separate these features by content, style, and interactivity. So again, going back to the two groups of features that we have, one is based on modality, other is based on just the nature of the feature. And we see that across screening and selection, the style features, and this could be coming from either linguistic style or audiovisual style, the style features are pretty important across these two stages of the process, screening and selection. We also go a little further and look at which features exactly are driving the screening and selection decisions. We use something called as a partial dependency plot, which is going a little below the hood as compared to just looking at feature importance. This allows us to actually see that not just which features are important, but also the nature of the impact of the feature. So is it linear impact or non-linear, or is it positive or negative? So we look at different features, and some interesting things we find is that, for example, in screening, for screening decisions, the energy of the voice, how bright the voice is very, very important. And so is the distance between hands. For selection, on the other hand, the linguistic style is very important. So if you're being less quantitative, less precise, that has a very negative effect on whether or not you will be selected. And we also found some interesting inverse U-shaped relationships. And what that means is, for something like hand gestures, it's important to have an optimal amount of them. So if you have too many hand movements, that can be distracting, but too few hand movements also don't give a good, are also not good for your success in the interview. And we find some interesting results around the interactivity parameters. For example, 55 to 60 turns seems to be like ideal in a 20-minute conversation, which means any monologue, that should be seconds, not minutes. So monologues longer than 20 seconds are actually hurt. So it's important to remain interactive and ensure there are enough turns in the conversation. And we did some more analysis on looking at specific data points, what is driving a specific result, but I'll not talk about them in this presentation in the interest of time. On true positives. So there's a question in the chat: is there significant difference between models' performance on true positives versus true negatives? So the answer is yes. I don't have the result right now, but one thing that we observed, especially when we looked at the combination of the AI hybrid, the combination actually helps a lot in reducing false negatives in the screening stage. I don't have the result right now, but we found that was a pretty interesting result. So that's one of the ways in which we can think about how the hybrid is improving the performance of the AI. And the second set of results is about how does the hybrid perform. So we have the same benchmark, and now we evaluate the hybrid model alongside the AI model. And just a reminder, the AI model was giving around 61% screening accuracy, 58% selection accuracy. But what we notice now is that there is a big improvement in both selection and screening accuracy by adding even one random human judgment in the loop. To be specific, we see that even one human improves the accuracy of screening from 61 to 75%, and improves the accuracy of selection from 58% to 71%. And now we also looked at, at which stage the role of human intervention is most critical. So the way to do it is instead of taking all the scores of the judges, we only take their scores for a certain stage and add it back to the AI model. And what we find is that the most benefit of human judgment actually comes from these early stages. And then when we add on the other stages, that is not improving the accuracy that much more. So most of the improvement has already come from incorporating the initial stages. And we did some cost analysis, like because there is a cost of adding a human in the loop. So we just make some conservative estimates, like if the cost of an expert judge is $100 per hour, then where are you exactly making, where is the actual benefit coming from? So we derive this measure of the cost effectiveness of including a human in the loop. So just like talking a little bit about the measure, we try to find out what is the additional cost of a human judge divided by the delta or increase in the number of candidates correctly selected. So we make these two cost metrics for both screening and selection. And here again, we find that the cost for incremental accuracy is actually much greater for screening, whereas the benefit of human judgment is greater for selection. Sorry. So what I meant is that the benefit of human judgment is actually greater for selection, because what is happening in screening is we're increasing the cost a lot more, but we are not improving the screening accuracy that much. Okay, so I think I have a couple of minutes more. So just giving an overview of where we are going with this work. So we have done some basic analysis to find out that what elements of the AI are actually impacting the performance of the model, and whether or not it's impacting or it's bringing a benefit in screening versus selection. Now we want to understand more that, where exactly the AI is making the human is making a difference. So if at all we want human intervention, why is it that human intervention is making the model better? So, and we have some initial hypotheses which we are trying to test. So one of the things that we see in the raw data, and especially looking at the misclassifications, one of the things we see is that generally the AI model is making errors because it's not able to differentiate things like confidence and nervousness, because it's relying too much on things like optimal amount of hand gestures or optimal amount of face movements. And these things could mean both. It could be confidence or it could be nervousness. And an actual human is able to interpret this correctly, whereas the machine is not able to. And these are some areas that we want to look at more carefully, and we want to understand the mechanism of how the hybrid is actually making an improvement over the AI. To summarize, what we do in this paper, we introduce an interview video-based AI selection approach to hiring, which enables us to move beyond resumes. And we look at multimodal data, text, audio, video data, and we show that they're all useful inputs to AI, but some elements are just more important than the others, especially in screening or selection decision. And we look at these modalities in more detail, and we try to understand that which modalities impact screening versus selection. And we find that the linguistic elements are very important for the selection decision, whereas the audiovisual elements are more important for like weeding out the bad candidates. And finally, to the research question around, is there a benefit of augmenting AI with humans? So the answer is yes. But the benefit is much more at the selection stage, whereas in screening stage, the additional cost of having an extra human is not really justified. And the other things that we want to now look at is, what exactly is the role of the human intervention? And our hypothesis is that humans are just good at interpreting some of these complex gestures, which could mean both nervousness and confidence, for example. Our findings have implications for designing AI-based hiring and evaluation tools for salespeople, but there are also implications in general for salesperson training and interview preparation, because we're actually opening up the black box and trying to understand that how an AI-based tool is able to score candidates or screen candidates or select candidates. And that's a question I see in the chat also. Any intuition on why human augmentation is more? Oh, okay, that's a different question. So the question
I think you've already kind of covered.
Yeah, but I think that's a very good question, and we are trying to understand that in more detail. So it could be that humans are they are just, things like rapport is very difficult for machines to judge. So humans are just good at it, but it could also be something like fatigue, that humans are just tired and they cannot be attentive throughout the whole process. So I think there could be competing explanations, and we are looking into that. Thank you, everybody. Should I keep my screen on or will we discuss?
And you're welcome to keep your screen on, Ishita. And I assume I can go ahead now and be the discussant.
Okay.
Should I start? I don't know who's monitoring. Okay.
I think so.
Okay. Hi, my name is Kalinda Yukonwa. I'm an assistant professor of marketing at USC's Marshall School of Business. I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. Are my slides visible? Okay, great. So first of all, I want to thank the organizers of the conference for inviting me to be a discussant on this paper. I found this paper to be really interesting. I think it's a very strong paper, so I'm pleased to have the role of discussing this paper and sharing some of my thoughts on this. So let me start off by commending the authors on this particular paper. Really enjoyed it. I'm going to do first a summary of the paper, and then at the end I'll share some of my comments. So just to summarize what we just heard Ishita talk about, this research examines the use of video in the screening and selection of Salesforce candidates in the hiring process. And the authors examine AI, human decision makers, and an AI human hybrid in that decision-making process, in the ability to screen out poor candidates and select good candidates. The intended contribution to the literature, there's really three major ones, which is methodologically developing a multimodal algorithm that has the capability to use video, text, audio in the pursuit of predicting best candidates and screening out poor candidates in the sales process, to identify interview behaviors and characteristics that are most predictive in that in those algorithms, and to empirically compare screening and selection performance of AI against human decision makers and an AI human hybrid algorithm. To the best of my knowledge in reading the literature, I'm not aware of anybody who's done this last one. In terms of the data they use, I think that there needs to be a large appreciation and perhaps in a way a contribution to the Academy and the data itself. It is a novel panel data set. It's a very rich data set with 195 videos of people in interviews, interacting in interviews, 20 minutes apiece. Within the context of a sales competition. There are 29 interviewers in this process. There's 261 judges that are third parties that are evaluating the performance of the interviewee based on these videos. So it creates a rich data set that includes unstructured data, video, audio, transcripts, and then there's the judge panel scores, which are being used as a basis to form the targets in this analysis, the ratings of the interview candidates based on these third-party judges. And then I was very impressed with the amount of not only the richness of the data, but the amount of analysis and work that went into extracting the features from this data. The authors used not only machine learning approaches, but also other analytic approaches to extract features, including from transcripts, the nature of the linguistic nature and style of the interview candidates, from voice, aspects about the voice of the candidates interactivity, and then from video using open pose, measures of body language, and how do all of these things affect the outcome of whether they are screened out or selected in the hiring process. The authors used several algorithms. Ishita mentioned random forest, but they also examined XGBoost and SVM classifiers to determine, based on the training data, whether there was accuracy in selecting who was going to be screened out amongst candidates on a test data set and who was going to be ultimately selected. AI human hybrid model that they developed was based on Bayesian updating, taking human judges scores from the testing data and using that as a source of the evidence. If you think of the estimate that came from the algorithms itself as a prior, using human judge scores as the evidence to produced updated or posterior AI scores. And they used that as the basis to see if that, in comparison against pure AI and pure human decision makers, to see if that improved the outcome. So the performance assessment is based on primarily two things, which are a balanced accuracy score, which is basically an average of the sensitivity and specificity, and then a screening error rate to assess which of these three modes of decision-making best performs in selecting good candidates and screening out poor candidates. So to summarize their findings, they found that energetic voice and interactivity, which are audio-visual features, had the greatest impact on screening outcomes. They found that, and these screening, once again, is about removing those who are considered poor candidates. Precise, quantitative, and informal language, basically linguistic style, they found had the greatest impact on selection. And that AI human hybrid algorithm outperformed both AI and just pure humans in the decisions of screening and selection. However, taking cost into account to see what was most cost effective, they found that AI algorithm would be most cost effective to use a pure algorithm, AI algorithm, for the screening process, which is the first stage, but that a human AI hybrid algorithm could be effective in the second stage in terms of selecting for top candidates. And then they found that human intervention was most effective based on the first 3 minutes of the interviews. So that gives an overview of the paper, or at least my takeaway of the paper. And so I felt this was, again, a very strong paper. I'd love to see this in print. There were 3 areas that I felt the authors may want to consider to make this an even stronger paper. And so I will now talk about what those comments are. The first being, authors strive to ensure that you can examine what the true salesability of each of the job candidates are if you control for elements that might affect evaluation in terms of biases. And so they talked about estimating what the true salesability is, controlling for some of the characteristics of the judges who are evaluating these candidates, including gender, some of the background. Furthermore, they made sure that there was some kind of balance in gender in terms of those who were judging. And so they produced estimated true salesability that would help to improve that mix. But I think there's a consideration and possibility for going further with this, because prior research has shown that not only can there be bias based on the characteristics of the interviewer, but there could be considerations of bias based on the nature of the dyad in the interview. And what I mean by this is, for example, if you have somebody who's a male interviewer who's interviewing women, they might systematically produce different results from somebody who's interviewing male candidates. And so fixed effect based on that judge may help control for this for some amounts of consistency with that judge, but may not control for the variability based on the nature of the candidate who they're interviewing. So my recommendation is you might want to consider including fixed effects that represent the dyad, the nature of the dyad in the interview. Who's the interviewer and who's the interviewee, and what's the combination. You may also want to consider that if you have enough data richness for race or ethnicity as a dyad, and then that might get you to a pure ground truth, so to speak, on what the true salesability is of the candidate. A second consideration is about the judges' scores and how it's used in the Bayesian update. My understanding is that judges' scores are used from the test data to Bayesian update the AI estimate of the true salesability of the candidate. But I think that same data is being used to form the target labels that allow you to assess whether the algorithms are accurate in the first place. And so if that is the case where judges' scores from the test data are informing both the Bayesian updates and the target labels, you may want to consider instead, because that could produce bias in the performance measures, consider using a holdout sample within the test data or getting fresh data of judges' scores to use only for either target labels or for the Bayesian updating, but not both. And that might give you some robustness to the results as well. And then the third consideration is about applicability of findings to other sales contexts. So a couple questions that arose in my head as I read through the paper includes, now you have the context in the competition where you have a third party which is evaluating the interviewee, but you have an interviewer who's not part of that evaluation. But in many contexts in real life, at least with corporations, the interviewer is also the judge. So the interviewer is conducting the interview and also evaluating or rating or scoring the interviewee. And so the question becomes, would the score show a different outcome as compared to a third party who's not involved with the interviewing process, but is evaluating the interviewee? My second question is about whether judge fatigue could explain the reason why human intervention seems to be most impactful in the first 2-3 minutes of the interview in your analysis. And so given that these judges are looking at several videos within this competition in a short period of time, they might start to fall back on a rubric where they're evaluating within that first few minutes, and that becomes the major source of their score. So the question becomes, in more natural settings where somebody who is judging or interviewing may not have such an intense scheduling of interviews, would it also reveal 2 to 3 minutes decides their score or influences the score, or could it be more phases in this interview process? And so both of these questions just are asking about, would this apply to other natural sales contexts, or can this be evaluated through other methods that would show robustness against that? And so with that, I think I am out of time. And so I'm going to stop here. Again, overall, really like this paper. A lot of exciting things come from it and thoroughly done. So my applause to the authors of this paper.
Thank you, Galinda. I think they're very interesting feedback, and we'll try to work on them as we revise the manuscript. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. See you tomorrow, I guess.
Inclusion, dissemination, very important.
Enjoy the weekend.
Topics for future research. Lastly, just to kind of touch upon this briefly.